Ok. Cuando yo empecé a fumar esta cochinada, esta droga, estaba con mi familia, con mis 6 hijos. Los dejaba a cargo con mi mamá. Me metí a la zona roja. Me prostituía para conseguir dinero, para llevar a la casa. Le daba el dinero a mi mamá para que se los alimentara y que fueran a la escuela. Da la casualidad que una vez duré un mes sin llegar a la casa, sin saber si han comido esos niños, si han ido a la escuela. Por cierto, tenía un niño de 9 meses, el último hijo que tuve. Lo dejé. Cuando llegué a la casa ya no estaban mis hijos, se los llevó el PANI.
Cuando la gente que está mucho más grande, con experiencias tan desgarradoras como las de ella, entran a un centro penal y tienen este tipo de experiencias, yo personalmente no podría leer esa experiencia como una ruptura, o sea, como algo que le permita cambiar radicalmente su forma de ver el mundo y su vida para cuando salga de ahí. Yo realmente no lo considero. ¿Por qué? Porque la cárcel, para nuestra desgracia, es un espacio que profundiza las cosas peores. Es así, no resalta las mejores. ¿Por qué? Porque son muchas personas a cargo de un personal, sí, profesional, pero con pocas posibilidades de darle seguimiento y contención a cada una de las personas, que son un montón las que están en la cárcel. Entonces son recursos muy limitados para un problema muy grande, que es un problema que excede la cárcel. Es un problema que viene de afuera y que se profundiza en el espacio penal al saber que estás encerrado.
Trabajé como un camello en la zona roja. Me daban cierta cantidad para que fuera a dejar a otras partes la droga. Ya cuando me pagaban cierta cantidad, me metía en un búnker y me saciaba de esa droga, y entre más se acababa quería más. Ya cuando no tenía nada, tenía que irme a prostituir. Nunca me voy a caer porque yo soy muy inteligente y yo soy la mamba y yo soy aquí y yo soy allá, hasta que por fin, ¡pum!, me caí con un billete marcado. Eran tantos años de trabajar vendiendo drogas que nunca me caí. Y llegó el momento en que me caí con un billete marcado de 2.000 colones. Y por ese billete de 2.000 colones fui a conocer al Buen Pastor. Los que se hacen de buena plata son los pescados grandes. Son los pescados. Los pescados grandes son los que nada más vienen y te dan, tome, aquí está, véndete esto y más tarde vengo a recoger la plata. En cambio, el pescado pequeño tiene que arriesgarse a que le hagan una redada, le abran la boca, tienes que tragarte ese poco de tóxicos dentro de vos. Tenés que cumplir, si se te perdió 10.000 pesos, tenés que buscar de dónde conseguir esos 10.000 pesos para podérselo dar al pescado grande, porque si no te mandan a matar. Una vez una amiga mía trabajaba con esta gente, con estas personas de pescados grandes, ¿verdad? Ella también era camello y supuestamente tenía compañía con un policía, y todo lo que hacían los pescados grandes ella se lo comunicaba a los policías, y la metieron en un cuarto. Nunca se me olvida. Nunca se me olvida ese terror. La metieron en un cuarto oscuro, agarraron una sierra, le taparon la boca, taparon los ojos, yo presencié todo eso. Y agarraron una sierra, le fueron cortándole dedo por dedo a ella. Nunca se me olvida, dedo por dedo, pedazos por pedazos. pedazos por pedazos. Se pusieron unas cosas como plástico para no mancharse de la sangre. Y los pedacitos le echaron en una bolsa y la fueron a tirar al Surquí. Porque ella fue y entregó dónde estaba toda la mercancía de esa gente. Dios a mí me ha librado porque fueron 26 años de trabajar vendiendo drogas en esa zona. ¿Te sentás ahí, por favor?
Una persona comete un delito, es juzgada, es metida a la cárcel, es apartada. Pero en el momento en que se aparta, pierde vínculos, pierde redes, pierde algún trabajillo que había tenido, ¿verdad? Entonces, 5 años después, cuando regresa, eso no existe. No existe ese espacio, no existen esos vínculos, algunos sí, de las personas que más les quieren, por supuesto, pero en términos laborales y de reinserción sigue convirtiéndose en algo muy complicado. Hace muchísimo tiempo, hablando de una cosa, dice otra, y dijo, yo antes de volver con mi marido que me maltrataba, yo prefiero ir a vender droga. ¿Verdad? Entonces uno dice, ¿cómo no entender estas historias en contexto? Yo no puedo entender el delito por sí mismo, yo no puedo entender el consumo problemático, comillas, de alcohol, de alguna sustancia ilícita, de crack, de marihuana, solamente porque la gente consume. Esa es la parte más sencilla. Lo difícil es poder entender eso en contexto y por qué han perdido históricamente esos vínculos familiares y por qué incluso por esto se han expuesto a involucrarse a dinámicas que tienen que ver con el tráfico.
Eso de que es un trabajo fácil, eso es una estupidez porque que tenés que arriesgarte a que te maten y todas esas cosas y tragarse esos tóxicos y meter esas cosas en la vagina, eso no es nada fácil. Fácil es para al portador que le da el tóxico, que nada más viene y recoge el dinero. Y si hablas alguna cosa, te matan. Entonces no es ningún dinero fácil. Y le pido a Dios hoy por hoy no volver a tocar esos tóxicos, ¿verdad? Me quedo con mi patí, porque lo mínimo que uno haga aquí o allá, te retroceden para el buen pastor. Entonces yo hago lo más bueno que puedo hacer y seguir las cosas bien, ir a la iglesia y hacer las cosas sanamente bien.
buenas tardes a todos las personas
Good
conectadas en los...
afternoon to all the people who are connected, looking at the second part of the second day of the International National Exchanges of Women in Drug Trafficking. And now we're going to begin with the introduction that I would like to carry out. As a moderator, I will introduce myself. I am Maria Alejandra Aguirre, expert in the government and criminal penitentiary policies within the Ministry of Justice and Law. In this opportunity, I will be speaking main topic today, which is the drastic illicit drug trade from the criminal policies in the perspective of gender. What we're going to be speaking about today is the block number 3, policies and criminals for women who are imprisoned because of drug crimes. Now, enter into the matter. It is very important to begin highlighting the attendance 646, excuse me, sentence 646 that defines the criminal policies of a response today for the country that have different perspectives in judgment that guarantees the women imprisonment in these jails in the territory under their that sometimes are understood as these measures from the
And
penal
here we
code.
have of the penal codes and all the policies that we may have. And then we have a penal policy in the three areas of criminalization. The first phase of criminalization, the primary criminalization, focused on setting norms, and there's a secondary criminalization that is focused really in the processes of investigation and prosecution, and then the third phase there focus on the execution of the sentencing and the execution of those sentences. We must understand that the criminal policy is a catalog of legal, judicial, economic, and administrative measures that enable one to kind of make the provision of a criminal policy in a provision ones and not only focus to the penal code alone, right? Albeit the criminal policy there is the one that regulates and the legislature that solves the social conflict that are considered of the most relevant. They must also have their, like, the last resort of in the juridical aspect that should be regulated among the others, and following these postulates or premises, the T762 that actually declares of certain unconstitutional matters, and it indicates how really the criminal policy really should protect the rights of those people that are deprived of liberty, and they have been populist, not reflective, or are incoherent, that actually do not benefit the people who are inmate and actually produce some damages among them. And that's why the policy of the state, not long ago, they approved, and we are in the implementation of the national policies that have policies like our minimum guidelines that integrate a public policy that guarantees the enforcement of preventive measures to actually have the penal alternative and the restorative justice. What they're trying to do is actually to give a differentiated focus to all the lines of criminal policy that they have, which is the preventions of homicides, the humanization of the penitentiary system, and the penitentiaries measures that prevent those crimes against vulnerable populations, among others. For all of this, and in the end, I wish to thank today the guest speakers that we have in this blog, because through their experiences and through their expertise, we want to know how they can actually give us in the context of from the experience of each one of them in respect of the problems that are actually present within the penitentiary system, as well as the measures and policies that have a gender policy geared specifically to women. Lastly, I invited our guest speakers today to be able to include in their questions, doubts, in the YouTube chat, so that we can actually gather those ideas and to be able to solve them at the end of this presentation. We can have a Q&A. Now, starting on the matters, I would like to introduce our three guest speakers. Our first guest speaker, Claudia Alejandra Cardona, the director of the corporation Free Women of the Humane Corporations of Colombia. She has an academic formation that is geared to protecting human rights. She's an expert on matters of promoting human rights of women that have left prison, and she's the founder and the director of Free Women, and she has abolished prisons for women, and she has the Círculo Gala of where they're caring for the matters of women who are in prison. The second guest speaker that we have the participation of Coleta Inger from Washington Office of Letting America from the UN. And Coleta is a senior officer of the Washington Office for Latin America, and she is a senior associate for the International Consortium on Drug Policy, and she is an expert in matters associated with women in prisons, and she has in the Americas, and she has more than 30 years working in drug policy for 30 years and in relationship between the region and the United States. She is the main coordinator of a project for women in drug policy and imprisonment that she has been the co-author of many reports on the subject matter. Mrs. Youngers, she also participates on WOLA in the consortiums of research of drugs, and she has a master's in public affairs in the Public Affairs Schools, International Public Affairs School of Princeton. And lastly, we have Dr. Sven Papers from the UN in the German office in preventing crime and penal crimes in the UNODC, and his specialized areas is that of human rights and discrimination based on gender, and his work has focused on violence against women and the treatment of women in contact with the penal system. In the justice system of the UNODC, his responsibility is to execute the World Program of Penitentiaries and the World Program of Preventing Crime and the penal systems response against women. And before he joined the UNODC, he was working in several government institutions in matters of police reform, human rights, and penal international law. And he has a master's in international law by the Bridgestone University in the UK. After this presentation, I would like to hand over the mic to Claudia Alejandra Cardona, one of the leaders and the president of the corporation Humanas, and she's going to speak about the affairs in Colombia for women. Claudia, the mic is all yours. Good afternoon, everyone here. Thank you very much for this invitation and for this panel. As was mentioned, Humanas Corporation, I lead there, and I also lead Mujeres Libres, of free women, women that were in prison and their family members. From my experience, after being in jail and be the accompaniment of women that are seeking their liberty and those that have actually finished their sentence, I'm going to speak about the problem that women suffer who are inmates. In Colombia, like in many other countries in the region, the main reason why women are in prison is because of their participation in crimes associated with drug trafficking. According to the report of the Institute, the Impact the Penitentiary Institute of Colombia, by the end of August of this year in Colombia, we had 6,816 women who were inmates, of which 48%, 17% are for drug trafficking, drug manufacturing, or drug marketing, and almost half of the women that are in prison in Colombia, and of them, 1,088 of them have not been ruled, they have not been sentenced yet, they're still awaiting crime. This number of women in prison is nothing less than the result of the failed war against drugs that through the punitive system actually affects poor women more than others, and they see in this trade a sort of a working opportunity and a way of making ends meet for their family, and that is one of the means of violence against women. The program in the jails is not an encouraging affair. The Constitutional Court has declared the state of inconstitutional matters in the Colombian penitentiary system, and also there are a series of authorities who are responsible of enforcing all the rulings of that constitutional court, and women live in conditions that are not dignified. They're overcrowding, the supply of water, bad food, the flaws in the provisions of health services, and the most serious and complicated of all these is that these conditions led so that the pandemic of COVID-19 be accelerated within the prisons, and that which has represented a high risk for health for their security and for their lives. From the beginning of the pandemic, there were some measures to prevent uh, the increase of this pandemic, and actually they generated new scenarios of breaching the rights based on the excuse that they were trying to control the pandemic. Among them was the prohibition of the visitors to come into the prisons. This had four specific effects. The people's defender were unable to come into the jails, limiting the access to their right to defense, delaying the penal processes, and affecting in particular the definition of the juridical status of those people who were awaiting trial, breaching, aside from the right to justice, and extending the time that they would have to stay waiting for a trial. This restriction of access also meant that there was no visit from family members, and this has generated an impact, emotionally speaking, and of course psychologically as well, of all their women and their family members. Many of those women, even by being in prison, they continue to be the caregivers in their home, and the contact with the family enables them to kind of sort of tolerate those living conditions in the, penitentiaries. The state did implement virtual meetings, but not all inmates have had access to these. Like they have like free telephone calls, and so we know that the access to telephone calls is not possible for all women, because these calls from prison are the ones that are the most costly of the Colombian market. On this, we have drawn their attention to the Commission of the Follow-up for several years now. I really don't know what happens really, but we have seen that in the male jails, we have seen that in social networks that they already have personal visits face to face, but in the jail of women of Bogota to date, and confirmed even today, they have not been able to see their daughters and children more than a year and a half without seeing their members and all, although this was a measure to prevent illnesses. But after so many months of all this time, it becomes a breach of their rights, really, and they also didn't have the access of doctors, and there before the pandemic, the health professionals like gynecologists would come in only once a month to the prison, and the brigades of making those swabs, they were done every 2 to 3 months. That care was insufficient for the amount of women that were inmates, but now everything is restricted. Aside from that, aside from suspending the access of external visits, the sexual activity of the women have been prohibited. The professionals in psychiatry and psychology was also suspended. Also, it was restricted the access of food, and the companies that are in charge of providing the food service did not give a dignified food. They have had some information given there by Corporación Humana and Mujeres Libres for about 3 months during the pandemic, revealed that the foods were given to women in bad eating condition, raw food, semi-raw food, bad tasting, strange or foul odors, and sometimes the food was already decomposing, which affects the health of those women. Also, I want to comment that the women file claims with this ones, and they mention to the institutions, but they continue to make it specific to actually have them there. So we don't know what's happening when they have some research, when they have some sanctions to any breach in the contract. Is the same companies that end up providing the food, even though there were claims filed against them. And so at the beginning of the pandemic, it was denied the access of products from family members from abroad, giving it to the inmates and so on, so that they were able to establish them, and they have these state actions for servicing the pandemic. The women did file claims about theirs, and before the pandemic, they lacked these elements, while the jail authorities only would give 20 sanitary napkins every 3 months, and this encouraged that there was a market of sanitary napkins within the eternity, or charging
money for guards charging money so that they can actually have some sort of a service to pass those their periods. In the last year and a half, we were unable to do a monitoring of the condition within the institutions with a personal vision to go and verify that things are okay the same way. And as we have as a second point within the establishment, we can do there the attention measures. They were not timely or sufficient, and they affected the right of health in such a way that it was disproportionate.
To attend this situation, the pandemic, the health personnel of these jails concentrate themselves in the prevention of contact and left aside all the other attentions that were supposed to be normal. They suspended all the medical attendance, dentistry, psychology attention, and they themselves needed to be attended by other health affectations that or ailments that were not related to COVID-19 before the pandemic. Well, this service already had great flaws, but during this isolation, we suspended all these helps without any help to assess their direct impact in the deterioration of the physical and emotional health of these women. And this has been evidencing itself. So authorities created health protocols, but the implementation took a very long time. The women throughout several months did not receive any hygiene elements like um, masks, soap, gels, or antibacterial gels to prevent COVID-19. Do not help them with any structural, like drinkable water. And we know that the supply of water in these places is not a permanent as they should be. So this facilitated the contagious and deaths. The suspension was also suspended the academic ones, sports, recreational, cultural, the entry of the support networks, and as we were mentioning before, they deteriorated their physical and mental health in prison, and given that they were restricted from many things. And we have observed that all these activities of resocialization that the government provides are not contributing for this at all because they're reproducing these being boxed in domestic tasks and they're not contributing to economical parts in the house like sewing, those beauty uh, programs, trainings that they have. And in these activities that were suspended throughout a long time, these women were living locked up within, I mean, inside being locked up, and the authorities never consider all these impacts. So in third place, the pandemic is a lost opportunity to advance in lost alternatives in prison. Wow. The world has recognized that the pandemic has shown us in a very cruel way this inequality of gender and the high concentration of women in caretaking. Colombia here, this analysis was not reached by these women. So in 2020, the national government presented the Decree 2046 to confront all these things that were happening, overcrowdedness in jails, and all these measures that have all these women that were pregnant, the women who were disabled, those who were sick, and those that were above 60 years of age. But this concrete decree destroyed more than 20 prisons, those crimes that were related to drug trafficking and other crimes that were not violent. For December 2020, 8 months after this decree was shown, they allow 815 people leave those jails, within those 45 women. So this decree ended up being a resonance measures or in all the communication means, but it was an illusory one for all those women that were deprived of their freedom, that were the least benefited from these international instruments as the Bangkok rules or the alerts of the human rights like Inter-American Commission, the human rights agencies. These have been ignored by the Colombian government, and there's a lack of knowledge of the human rights here. Not even the state laws and these prisons or these jails, and especially these women that have been deprived from the prison, and they do not see it as a reality. So these orders that were issued by the Constitutional Court have not achieved or accomplished to correct these violations against human rights by giving them freedom. So I would like to wrap this intervention up, manifesting that we do need to question this situation in a stronger way, and we should find a road or around so we can go from the denouncements to real change, to demand materialization of the gender focus in all the actions that they are from the responsible authorities of these people who have been deprived of liberty. Thank you very much, Claudia, for your intervention. We would like to thank you for your exposition, and we are going to give the floor to our second presentation by Kalita Younger from Washington. And this one is going to be, the impact is proportionated to all the crimes and these drug-related crimes in Latin America. I will give you the floor now.
There we go. Hello. First, I would like to thank UNODC and the Colombian Ministry of Justice and Law for inviting me to participate in this conference. You've pulled together an absolutely terrific group of speakers. I've been enjoying listening since yesterday, and I'm honored to be included in this session with Claudia and Sven and Alejandra. I am going to speak in English, but my PowerPoint is in Spanish because most of the people who've been watching are Spanish speakers. If you want to hear me in my native language, you can switch to the English channel, and otherwise you'll hear the interpretation. So the focus of my presentation is on the disproportionate impact of punitive drug policies or punitive drug laws on women in Latin America. And, we've been hearing a lot about this throughout the course of today. In the last session, we talked specifically about Mexico and Costa Rica. You've just heard about Colombia. So I hope what I'll be able to do is give a more global perspective without repeating too much of what you have already heard. But I'd like to start by saying a little bit more about how I got involved in this work. As was mentioned in my introduction, I'm part of a research team, CED, El Colectivo de Estudios Drogas y Derecho, that did the first investigation published in 2010 on drug laws and prisons in Latin America. So we all knew from our firsthand research in the prisons that punitive drug policies seemed to be the cause of the region's crisis of prison overcrowding. But this was the first report that actually documented that impact. And when we did that research, we decided to focus on certain sectors, one of which was women. And I was so struck as we were compiling the data, one, about the rapid rise in women's incarceration, and second, the percentage of the female prison population incarcerated for drugs, which tended to be so much higher than that of men. And so those trends, of course, have continued since then, and I'll talk about that a little more in my presentation. But that's what really got me interested, and I really shifted the focus of a lot of my work to focus on this issue. So out of that, some of us, me and my colleagues, came together and formed a working group on women, drug policy, and incarceration. It's a really interesting mix of experts on drug policy, human rights experts, representatives of feminist organizations, and some government officials operating in their individual capacity. And I think bringing together these different sectors made our work so much stronger. And we've produced quite a lot in our short time together. We did a guide for policy reform that's really a roadmap for policymakers who want to reduce their female prison population. We've documented innovative approaches. We've produced many collaborative reports covering issues from pretrial detention to house arrest to trans women in prison. And we've sought to change the narrative of who are the women behind bars through photo essays, videos, and the like. And perhaps most importantly, we're now focused on supporting the growing movement of formerly incarcerated women around the world, and in particular Latin America, because those most directly impacted by punitive policies should be the ones developing the policy alternatives. And I believe that very strongly. So I'm going to talk today about, and is the PowerPoint working? ¿Está funcionando el PowerPoint? Because I don't see it on my screen. There we go. Thank you. So today I'm going to...
Sí, Coleta, yo sí veo la presentación.
Sí, yeah, ahora lo veo. So today I'm going to present data that we collected in 2020 for a report published in November of that year, Women Behind Bars for Drug Offenses in Latin America, What the Numbers Make Clear. At the time, it was the most recent available data that we could find in Latin American countries, in the Latin American countries that we looked at. Those of you who do research on this in this area know that it's often very hard to get detailed data on incarceration. So there are definitely gaps. And the primary sources we used were the World Prison Brief and data from national level government agencies. And I say we as the person who actually did what we call the deep data dive, was my former colleague, Teresa Garcia Castro, and another colleague, Kiki Mansour, also worked on the report. So the basic conclusion that we arrived at after doing this research, which will come as no surprise to any of you, is that women's incarceration in Latin America has increased dramatically over the last 2 decades. Not only have the sheer numbers increased, but the percentage of females in the overall prison population has also risen. And the rate of the ongoing increase in the size of the female prison population is simply alarming. Moreover, the number of women being put behind bars is growing much faster than the number of men. So these trends cannot be explained by the overall female population or simply by the increase in the total number of prisoners. Rather, the driving force behind this data is the adoption of punitive drug laws that disproportionately affect women. So we've talked a lot about this, so I will be today, so I will be very brief. But the women incarcerated in Latin America for drug offenses tend to have very similar socioeconomic characteristics and backgrounds. They come from situations of pervasive poverty and inequality, low levels of education, are either unemployed or underemployed, often working in the informal economy. They may become engaged in the drug trade to put food on the table for their families and pay the rent. Many of them also come from a background of physical and sexual abuse. I think something we need to have much more investigative work done on. And well, for many, getting involved in the drug trade may be a very conscious decision. It's a very rational reaction to solving a problem of not having a decent income. And we heard in the previous section a very eloquent explanation of that by Claudia Palma Campos. But there are others who may be coerced by intimate partners or family members, or they may be brought into a family business, or get tricked or deceived, unaware, for example, that the suitcase they may be carrying contains drugs. And still others may become involved because of their own drug dependency. As we've also heard, women's tasks in the drug trade include being a human courier or transporting drugs within a country or across borders, small-scale sellers, smuggling drugs into prison, or working in the cultivation, storing, cleaning, delivery, and packaging of cannabis, cocaine, or heroin. It is important to note, however, that a very small number of women do reach the higher echelons of the drug trade, may play a more active role in the organizations, as was documented in a report in 2019 by the Colombian Observatory of Organized Crime. I think it's really important to note that the incarceration of these women does absolutely nothing to disrupt drug markets or thwart the drug trade, as these women are primarily engaged in high-risk but low-ranking jobs, and they are very easily replaced, while those running criminal enterprises rarely end up behind bars. Yet the consequences of incarceration for these women, their families, and their communities is just devastating, as was shown in the Ministry of Justice report that was presented earlier today. The COVID-19 pandemic and its disproportionate impact on people in prison gives even greater urgency to implementing reforms to dramatically reduce the number of women behind bars, as Claudia has explained to us just now. So what do the numbers tell us? Women's incarceration in Latin America has increased dramatically in the last 2 decades. not only have the sheer numbers increased, but the percentage of females in the overall prison population has also risen, and the rate of female prison population increase is simply alarming. According to the Institute for Criminal Policy Research, as of 2017, there were at least 714,000 women and girls held in penal institutions around the world, and that number represents 6.9% of the global prison population. As of 2018, many countries in Latin America had higher female percentages of the prison population than the global percentage of 6.9%. So table 1 here shows the latest data on female prisoners in Latin America. It shows the number and percentage of all prisoners who were women at the time, like I said, that we did this research. And my apologies, I have three slides in a row that have a lot of data, but this goes in the order of countries with the highest percentage of prisoners who are women, so you can easily see which countries rank at the top of the list. Obviously, there are more men in prison than women, but what we find is that expressed in terms of the population rate, which is the number per 100,000 women in the overall population, the incarceration of women in the Americas is the highest in the world at 31.4 per 100,000. Even excluding the United States, that data includes the United States, but even excluding the US, the rate in 2017 was still 14.6, which was higher than in other regions. Latin American countries with particularly high female incarceration rates are El Salvador, Panama, Costa Rica, Uruguay, and Brazil. And so here, table 2 shows the data we compiled on the female prison population rate in Latin America. Again, it goes in order with the highest at the top. So what you see is that the rate of increase of the female prison population so basically the point of this is that unless governments change their approaches to dealing with drug use and the drug trade, the problem of incarceration of women in Latin America is only going to continue to worsen. These numbers are only going to get worse. So let's turn now to look at the percentage increases in the female prison population. We calculated these numbers based on data from the World Prison Brief. This is the last really dense chart, I think, that I'm going to show you. But since the early 2000s, Latin American countries have witnessed a rapid increase in their female prison populations, as I said. So this table shows the increase in the female prison population since around the early 2000s to the most recent year with available data for Latin American countries. So countries like El Salvador had in 2020 7 times the number of female prisoners as compared to 2000, while Guatemala had 6 times their number of female prisoners from 2001. Over about a 20-year period, the female prison population in Brazil increased by 268%. In Ecuador, it was 283%. And we have found in looking at Ecuador that there are times when, and periods of time when 80% of women in Ecuador are there for drug offenses. So I think it's really important to point out that women's incarceration is growing at a much faster rate than men's incarceration. According to the World Prison Brief's female imprisonment list, between 2000 and 2017, worldwide, the total female prison population increased by 53.3%, while that of men increased by only 19.6%. In Latin America, the driving force behind these trends is the adoption of punitive drug laws that disproportionately affect women. So many factors, numerous factors explain how drug laws fuel the region's prison crisis. Harsh and disproportionate sentencing policies, increase in the number of drug-related offenses, increase in the minimum and maximum sentences, failure to distinguish between level of involvement in the drug trade, failure to distinguish between violent and nonviolent offenses, and failure to take into account mitigating circumstances. And the last 3 are particularly problematic for women. It is also the case that often all drug offenses are precluded from benefits such as alternatives to incarceration or early release, resulting in those convicted for low-level offenses spending even more years behind bars. So the cumulative effect of these characteristics of drug laws is that governments across the region are filling their prisons beyond bursting with men and women accused of low-level drug offenses for excessively long periods of time. So we also find that not only are women going to prison at a faster rate, but there are higher percentages of women in prison for drug-related offenses as compared to men. According to the UNODC's 2018 World Drug Report, 35% of the world's female prison population is incarcerated for drug-related offenses, while 19% of the world's male prisoners are behind bars for the same reason. 10 out of the 12 Latin American countries that we studied have a higher percentage of women incarcerated for drugs, have a percentage of women incarcerated for drugs that is higher than the global average percent of 35%. Drug-related offenses are the main cause of female incarceration in the majority of countries that we looked at in Latin America. For instance, available data at the time showed that in Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Mexico, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, and Venezuela, drug-related offenses were the most common for female prisoners. So Table 4 shows the latest available data for the percentage of women incarcerated for drug offenses in Latin American countries out of the total female prison population. So you see that Panama, Costa Rica, and Venezuela and Brazil top the list of countries with the highest percentage of women incarcerated for drug offenses within the female prison population. So although in sheer numbers, more men than women are incarcerated for drug-related offenses in Latin America, the percentage of women imprisoned for that offense is always higher than the percentage of men. In Brazil, Chile, Costa Rica, Panama, and Peru, there is more than a 30% difference between the percentage of women incarcerated for drug-related offenses as compared to that of men. And I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. But first, I wanted to show you this slide of Sarah. And I wanted to do that because I wanted to remind you that I'm talking about all these numbers with all these charts, but there are real people behind these numbers. And we need to be thinking about the lives that are impacted as we look at the data and we look at the numbers. So Sarah was 50 years old when we interviewed her a few years ago. She'd been in and out of prison her whole life. She fled her family at the age of 13 to escape sexual abuse by her uncle. She had no education, we had very little education, no opportunities. She essentially became drug dependent and worked in the sex trade. She was arrested for selling small quantities of crack to support her own consumption. And during her last arrest, out of desperation, she attempted to bribe the police officer, detaining her with the equivalent of $3.75, which landed her in prison for almost another 2 years, in addition to her original sentence. So back to the numbers. Graph 1 shows the percentage of women incarcerated for drug-related offenses out of the total female prison population compared to the percentage of men incarcerated for drug-related offenses out of the total male population. The women are in blue, men are in green. Notice the difference in Panama. 70% of the female prison population is behind bars for drug offenses as compared to 31% of men. I think the bars here speak for themselves. So finally, I would like to take just a minute to talk about the issue of pretrial detention before concluding. So the excessive use of pretrial detention is a primary factor contributing to the over-incarceration of women for drug offenses in Latin America. A significant percentage of women deprived of liberty in Latin America are in pretrial detention. As recognized in the Bangkok rules, women are at high risk of sexual violence and other forms of abuse while being held in pretrial detention. They're separated from their children and families. And of course, they're living in horrible conditions, even though they are still presumed innocent. At the time we did this research in Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, Guatemala, Mexico, Panama, Paraguay, and Uruguay, more than half of incarcerated women had not been sentenced, and with many languishing for several years in pretrial detention. We heard in the last session that 60% of women in Mexico's federal prison system have not been sentenced. The data we gathered showed that with the exception of Panama, the proportion of women held as pretrial detainees was higher than the case of men, albeit in some cases with a small margin of difference. So for example, in Mexico, Argentina, Chile, and Guatemala, the percentage of women in pretrial detention was around 20, 15, 10, and 8 percentage points higher than men, respectively. Again, drug laws are the driving factor here. In most countries, pretrial detention for those accused of any drug offense is either mandated by law or is the norm. As a result, in many Latin American countries, drug-related offenses are one of the most common for female pretrial detainees. And of course, we find cases of both women and men who spend more time in prison in pretrial detention than the sentence for which they were arrested in the first place. In Peru, Ecuador, Argentina, and Chile, around half of women were in pretrial detention for drug offenses. So this graph compares the percentage of women in pretrial detention for drug offenses in 4 select countries: Argentina, Colombia, Peru, and Uruguay. Again, women are in blue, men are in green. In some countries, women accused of having committed drug-related offenses are much more likely to be held in pretrial detention than men that are accused of the same crime. Here we see that in Argentina, Peru, and Uruguay, the percentage of women in pretrial detention for drug-related offenses is 3 times higher than that of their male counterparts. And in Colombia, the percentage of women is more than double that of men. In Argentina, in 2017, 70% of the women in prison for drug-related offenses were in pretrial detention. Again, we find a disproportionate impact on women. So I think the data presented here paints a very clear picture. Latin American countries are incarcerating alarming numbers of women, primarily for low-level drug offenses, and the numbers keep going up. As noted at the start of my presentation, this does nothing to disrupt drug markets or thwart the drug trade, as the overwhelming majority of these women pose absolutely no threat whatsoever to society. They are primarily engaged in high-risk, low-ranking tasks and are easily replaced, while those who are running the drug trade and reaping the profits rarely end up behind bars. Yet, as we've been discussing today, the consequences of incarceration for these women, their families, and their communities can be just devastating. So we've already heard from Claudia about the horrendous conditions and challenges women face behind bars, and they also face tremendous obstacles to rebuilding their lives upon leaving prison. The vast majority of women behind bars entered prison already in situations of vulnerability, including poverty, low levels of education, and lack of job opportunities. Upon their release, they have a criminal record, which makes it even harder to find employment and decent housing. They struggle to get their kids back if they are mothers. In addition, they face greater stigma than men do for having landed behind bars. This has been a sort of recurring theme today, but I think it is worth repeating. They are not only seen as criminals, but also as bad women or bad mothers because they did not fulfill the role that society assigned to them. In other words, women experience greater prejudice and judgment than men due to gendered societal expectations. In short, current drug policies make women's situations of vulnerability, including poverty and lack of opportunity, even worse. Prison isn't working. That's the crux of the issue. So I'm going to conclude with just a few thoughts on alternative approaches. Sven's going to talk about alternatives to incarceration. So I just wanted to leave you with sort of 2 big picture recommendations. One is to rethink drug policies. Decades of experience has shown that harsh drug laws, and sentencing policies have failed to make any dent in drug markets or the drug trade. Sentences need to be commensurate with the gravity of the crime committed. Mandatory minimums should be eliminated, and the use of pretrial detention should be the exception rather than the rule, among other reforms. Better yet, countries should move in the direction of decriminalization, in other words, removing criminal penalties for possession and small-scale cultivation of drugs and drug crops, and creating legally regulated markets, beginning with cannabis and other less dangerous substances, in order to take organized crime and the violence and corruption it generates out of the drug trade. And second, we need to decarcerate and provide alternatives to incarceration. It is long past time to fundamentally rethink who was put behind bars and for what reasons, and perhaps more importantly, to explore alternatives to incarceration. These can range from doing community service, to going to school, to job training, opportunities that can help women earn an income and rebuild their lives and hence reduce recidivism. Even better, rather than investing in prisons, governments should invest in communities. They should invest in reforms and programs that promote gender equality and socioeconomic justice. Today, we have heard the expression several times to humanize humanizar la cárcel, to humanize prisons. And I appreciate the sentiment behind that. We all want to see better conditions in prison and more opportunities for women in prison. But we are talking about putting people in cages, and it's really hard to humanize that. Let's provide women with opportunities before they get funneled into the criminal justice system. Let's provide women with the resources and skills they need to live lives with dignity. And most importantly, let's put an end to the incarceration of women and girls. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have a lot more resources available on issues related to women in incarceration, which can be found at womenanddrugs.wola.org or mujeresydrogas.wola.org. That concludes my presentation. Thank you for bearing with me through all the data presentation. And I think this is a really good point or place to transition to Steve's presentation on alternatives to incarceration.
Muchas gracias, Coleta, por la intervención que has realizado. Y damos el espacio a
We
nuestro
have had here, and now we're going to give the venue to our last guest speaker, Mr. Sven Paper, who is a prevention officer of the penal section of the UNODC, who will tackle these measures that are not incarceration, international standards and recommendations. Sven, the mic is all yours.
For including me in this very interesting conference, and I'm so happy to be part of the illustrious group of experts, as well as proud to have so many women with actual lived prison experience involved in this conference, which is really important because they are the first-hand experts about the topic that we want to resolve and that we're talking about. So I'm really happy that colleagues managed to involve so many great experts in this. My presentation is going to be about gender-responsive non-custodial measures. Taking up the point that Coletta mentioned, let's try to get them out of prison as much as possible instead of trying or at least in addition to trying to make the experience of imprisonment better and more human. I would like to, I hope you can see the slides, and I would like to base my presentation on a new toolkit that we have elaborated on the basis of the Bangkok rules to stress exactly this aspect, the non-custodial measures aspect, which is an important part of the Bangkok rules, in addition to what happens inside prison and the treatment of women prisoners. So this new toolkit has 3 objectives. First of all, it aims at identifying the needs of women in contact with the law. Secondly, at ensuring gender equality in the use and application of non-custodial measures. And thirdly, it also looks at specific groups of women, including women arrested for drug-related offenses. So that's why my presentation will address this aspect. I was going to talk about what we know at the global level, and it reflects, sadly, what so many of you have already referred to in relation to the different countries that you work in and regions. And I'm not going to spend much time on it because Coletta has actually also brought up all this global data that we have at our disposal. So maybe just to recap that we also see beyond the region of Latin America largely the same issues that so many of you have described. Whereas men in the criminal justice system are the majority, they're often in contact for violent offenses. Hence, the system is totally geared towards their needs and their necessities, and they tend to have more resources and information about their rights and how to navigate the system. On the other hand, women are the minority, often commit non-violent offenses, have typically a number of childcare responsibilities that fall on them, as well as backgrounds that men don't have, like a history of victimizations, drug use disorders, and specific mental health profiles. The global data, again, also beyond the context of Latin America, the increase of the female prison population is alarming and is exceeding that of the male one. And the highest rises, as Coletta mentioned, has occurred in the Americas. We also have surveys and research in different countries and different prisons at our disposal beyond your region, and it shows largely the same issues that women prisoners face, ranging from social stigma, gender-based violence, caring responsibility, lower socioeconomic indicators in terms of, for example, education, illiteracy, everything that has been mentioned. I'm also happy that Claudia Palma Campos and also Coletta mentioned our UNODC drug report. Indeed, the issue of women ending up in prison for drug offenses much more than men is something that we see at the global level as well. Just as a reminder, women are rarely major players in the organized drug trafficking. They carry out low-level but high-risk tasks and often end up in prison in connection with the drug dependency, situations of manipulation and coercion, but also, as has been mentioned, as a conscious decision. But how much of a decision is it really if the alternative is to not be able to feed your family? UNODC has also published in the same report that we referred to something about the different backgrounds of women in terms of their drug use. It's important to note that women have different patterns or tend to have different patterns when they use drugs. For example, they are more likely than to identify trauma or other issues like relationship issues when it comes to the initiation of their drug use. They also start using drugs later than men, but later increase consumption much more rapidly. And also there's a correlation between gender-based violence and use of drugs among women, which is something that needs to be taken into account. So let's move to the real focus of my presentation, which is international standards and what are we going to do about all these problems. First of all, and that they explicitly mention that not only in relation to personal consumption offenses like growing marijuana for your own consumption, but also for trafficking offenses in minor cases. So that is the avenue to take measures, alternative measures with regard to the involvement of women in drug trafficking that we've been talking about. And these alternatives, the drug conventions say, are not only for people with drug use disorders, in terms of treatment, but they also contemplate alternatives for other people committing drug offenses. And they mention measures relating to education and social reintegration. So there is a firm basis, and the drug control conventions cannot be used as an excuse not to do anything about it. It's important also to consider when to use alternatives. You don't have to wait until a judgment is being delivered or until prison and try early release. Alternatives should start at the very beginning, ideally before prosecution is started. And in this slide, you can basically see the different pathways that hopefully, when done well, can lead out of the criminal justice system and into community-based alternatives, and the different actors that need to be involved. So it's not just courts and judges and prison officials, but it's also, and importantly, police, prosecution, and probation service providers. I hope everyone here is familiar with the Bangkok rules. If you're not, please do read them and incorporate them in everything you do, whether it's studies, advocacy, or policy work or operative work in the criminal justice system, because they are really practical and they are actually based on the agreement of your own member states government. In 2010, all member states of the UN in the world came together and adopted these rules. So none of these states should have an excuse not to do anything about it. It's the first gender-specific instrument that basically aims at eliminating discrimination against women in the criminal justice system. It supports other sets of rules like the Nelson Mandela rules for the treatment of prisoners, or the Tokyo rules for non-custodial measures in general, by providing a gender perspective and include what was missing from these instruments. And if you remember only one thing today about the Bangkok rules, then it should be this. What it says about non-discrimination and substantive equality. It says that taking into account and providing for the distinctive needs of women shall not be considered discrimination, but is actually required to accomplish substantial gender equality. And those of you who work in prison know that treating everyone the same is not meeting the obligations under non-discrimination law. It's actually recognizing specific needs and addressing them. There's 4 Bangkok rules that I want to flag when we talk about women and drugs in prison, that concerns rules dealing with the health screening that needs to be done, which should include a screening for drug dependency. There's another rule talking about substance abuse treatment that should be responsive to women's backgrounds. All that we've been talking about in this conference should be taken into account when decisions are taken, including in prison. And that also goes for gender-sensitive risk assessments and classification of prisoners. And similarly, rules that talk about things that should happen outside or instead of prison. The Bangkok rules specifically mention gender-sensitive substance abuse treatment programs, which should happen in the community, which should be trauma-informed, and also include women-only options. And then there's a whole set of rules that talk about different types of alternatives, from the pretrial to the sentencing to the post-sentencing stage, where basically the crux of the issue is to consider, whenever taking a decision at those stages, consider the backgrounds and circumstances of the women that are concerned. I also wanted to mention some of the recommendations and specific examples that you will find in the toolkit. A first set of recommendations concerns a fundamental issue of criminal policy, and that's reconsidering whether and how much criminal law is actually needed to address the drug-related conduct that has caused so many women to be incarcerated. And here, key recommendations are to avoid criminalizing drug use. The drug conventions never say that drug use itself should be criminalized, and also to consider decriminalizing or depenalizing personal consumption offenses. And as Coletta mentioned, one of the difficult issues that have caused so many problems in practice are mandatory minimum sentences in law. And the recommendation is to avoid them either when you reform those laws, or if you have discretion, to avoid seeking them if you're allowed to not seek them as a prosecutor, for example. So less punitive approaches are possible within the framework of the drug conventions. A number of countries have already initiated or adopted legal reforms to decriminalize offenses like personal consumption or cultivation for personal consumption. And imprisonment, as Coletta mentioned, for minor drug-related offenses is often unnecessary. We find that it's ineffective in reducing recidivism. It aggravates social, economic, and health issues of those involved, as well as we've heard, their communities, their families. And it also overburdens the criminal justice system and prevents it from effectively addressing those crimes that put us all at risk. The most famous example, perhaps, of a state that decriminalized low-level drug possession is Portugal. They are basically transformed anyone who has less than 10 days worth of drug supply from a criminal into just an administrative violation, so like a traffic offense. That person will be referred to an administrative body composed of different professionals, legal, social, and medical experts, and we'll get some kind of intervention ranging from a warning to educational measures. It has had good effects. It reduced the prison overcrowding problem that existed. It also helped refocusing law enforcement efforts on more violent and organized crime. But it's also not the perfect example here because it actually lacked tailored services for women and a gender-sensitive approach. So if we take Portugal, let's make sure to adopt the gender perspective and think about things like, when is it open, opening hours? Does the woman have to take her child, for example, to school? Services like childcare, sexual and reproductive health services, and so on, should be part of, of the thinking that goes into when we consider such a model. Another set of recommendation aims at increasing the use of non-custodial measures and of making them sensitive to the needs of women arrested for drug offenses. And there, following the Bangkok rules, we say that non-custodial sentences should be preferred, especially if the woman has dependent children or other dependents. I already mentioned the issue of gender-specific treatment programs in the community when women actually suffer from drug use disorders. And finally, another issue that comes up in practice that is hampering efforts in the implementation of the Bangkok rules is compulsory rehabilitation in detention, because often states say, yes, we have this as an alternative, but what actually happens is that people get confined, they get provided with treatment, which is not in line with scientific evidence, and it's just another form of deprivation of liberty instead of a real and gender-sensitive alternative. What do we mean by gender-responsive treatment and services for women with drug use disorders in the community? I just selected two examples. One is the WINGS project. It's called Women Initiating New Goals for Safety, which is an evidence-based screening, intervention, and referral tool that was developed at Columbia University, specifically for low-resource settings. And it's designed to identify different types of gender-based violence among women who use drugs, enable them to develop safety planning, strengthen their social support network, and also help them access different services to reduce their risk. It's been piloted in different countries, including in India, which is one of the examples you will find in our toolkit. And another example is the Addiction Recovery Community Association in Indonesia that is running a halfway house that offers both inpatient and outpatient services. It has a number of women users, and there's specific female staff and counselors available on site to tailor drug treatment plans to the needs of their women clients. They offer services like counseling, psychosocial support, life skills training. So it's a whole range of packages that is actually needed to help women, get back to a normal life, get back on track, instead of having to wait until incarceration to for the first time, in some cases, receive actual services from the state. Another recommendation I wanted to mention is that it's important to remove any legal obstacles and practical barriers to non-custodial sentences for women who are arrested for drug offenses. And that requires a review of laws, of sentencing guidelines, and of practices to evaluate whether they are in compliance with existing standards under your constitutional law, proportionality, international human rights. And what we recommend is that proportionate sentencing frameworks should consider the type of drugs, the scale of the illicit activity, but also the role and the motivation of women in conflict with the law. Are they serious organized traffickers, or are they just micro traffickers doing this to feed their family? Also evaluate the health issues that are faced by women, especially those who are dependent on drugs or have drug use disorders. And then socioeconomic issues like poverty, caretaking obligations, prior victimization, and so on. And for drug-related offenses committed due to drug dependency or to meet basic economic needs, other alternatives like treatment, education, rehabilitation, social integration programs should be offered as a more humane but also more effective alternative to conviction. One example I have in terms of a state that has reformed their sentencing practices is the UK, where sentencing guidelines were issued in order to provide a more nuanced approach. Since 2011, there's different roles that are being considered when judges assess someone who has committed a drug offense. There's categories including a leading role, a significant role, or a lesser role, instead of just saying drug offense, hence punishment X. The guidelines also oblige judges to consider circumstances of vulnerability, which many of the examples that you've shared would qualify for, in addition to the quantity of drugs involved. And in 2021, there was actually an update because they found that ethnicity as well as sex made a difference when it came to sentencing and practice. So the new guidelines specifically draw attention to disparities in different drug offenses that have, for example, had a higher proportion of Asian ethnicity offenders being convicted than white ones. So that's an interesting development as well. If you don't have sentencing guidelines, follow the example of Costa Rica. In Costa Rica, there was a new law introduced in 2013. Unfortunately, it only relates to one specific offense, but nevertheless important, as we've heard, the issue of bringing drugs into prison for often a male relative, which was punished very harshly, and the new law reduced the punishment, but importantly, it also allowed specific groups of women to obtain alternative sentences. For example, women living in poverty, women with caretaking responsibilities, heads of households, or older women in conditions of vulnerability are or have since 2013 been eligible for house arrest, for supervised release, for residence in a halfway house, or electronic monitoring. And the immediate results were that 120 women of 150 in the female prison were released, and it basically solved the overcrowding problem, just this one small reform. And it is also an example of how to make sentencing more proportionate, using an approach that focuses on people and not on drugs. Because often the focus is on the quantities or the types of drugs, and it doesn't take into account the lived realities of the women that we've been hearing about and that we've been discussing about. So that's an interesting example to consider as well. And I also wanted to mention that, as Coletta said, there's real women, real lives are impacted. So we try to reflect that as well by putting case studies for when we want to use this tool, or when you want to use this tool, maybe because it's available in Spanish as well, for trainings or for advocacy. There will be case studies and questions. It's geared to criminal justice providers, but it's based on actual women and the stories and the type of violence and hardships that they have experienced. Finally, someone raised before, what happens after or instead of prison? Are states providing the services that are needed to prevent women from reoffending and from being reincarcerated? Because often we have this revolving door issue that without appropriate services outside, housing, education, finding a job, women will just get reincarcerated. And there's a specific tool that is also available in Spanish, published by our office, which is a guide on post-release support on the prevention of recidivism and the social reintegration of offenders. It deals with why and how to invest in relevant services, It deals with not just prison-based programs, which we heard are important, but also post-release support programs and services and how they can connect. And it has specific chapters on women and on people with drug use disorders. So I just thought this might be hopefully interesting for all of you as well. And I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Muchas gracias por la intervención. Entonces, como lo mencionó el doctor Sven, bueno, ya pasamos a nuestro espacio de preguntas y respuestas, no sin antes agradecerle a usted las intervenciones. Y además quiero destacar unos puntos específicos expuestos en las ponencias, como lo indica la doctora Claudia, con el tema de la pandemia del COVID-19, se presentaron más, digo más porque ya habíamos...
COVID-19, we had more, I say more because we have had some unconstitutional things given to health and food, and we saw many more things of these things that people go through when they are in prison, especially women, especially these health services, given that they had more, they gave more attention to the prevention of the infection of COVID-19, but in all these specializations and consequently to this, this common point is the implementation of these. I lost my sound. No sound.
Bueno, parece que tuvimos un problema con con la conexión de María Alejandra. Entre tanto, ella retoma, seguimos acá conectados con los ponentes y una primera pregunta antes de que ella regrese.
With the first question before she comes back.
Empezando por Claudia, luego Coleta y Sven.
Starting with Claudia and then Oleta and Sven.
¿Cómo fortalecer?
We have a question, how to strengthen the knowledge of these women who are deprived of their liberty because of crimes related to drugs and given to their processes. This is a little bit of the topic that we have been speaking about. And now I will give the floor to Maria Alejandra so she can continue. Thank you very much. I'm sorry. I lost my sound, but I was beginning with the points that I was highlighting. And the last point I was going to highlight was the one if inequality, we must revise these systems, these distinctive measures that are required to guarantee. And as Alejandro was mentioning before the Q&A session, we have the first question, that is how to strengthen the knowledge of these women who have been deprived of their liberty, the fundamental.
With the rights that they have to be prosecuted in due process. How do we strengthen that knowledge of all the rights that they have in procedural law? Well, in their daily lives, in their jails, if they don't even know what are the rules to live there, and then what we have to do and we will do, and then they don't even know how to answer to the guards and so on. So yes, there should be firstly like whenever you get to prison, to begin to know the system, because simply, I mean, women, they're brought to jail, and then after some days, they begin to know what they have to do, what processes they must follow, that there should be a system of the different phases during the years that they're going to be as inmates, but they do not know anything further. The Impact has a program that is called like induction to treatment, but this induction is after some time. It's not immediately upon arrival. So yes, it should be like an immediate arrival basis so that women will be able to know everything to which they have a right, and to implement training sessions even of what we were talking about the Bangkok rules. I mean, the women in jails do not know what Bangkok rules are, and I do it by experience. I was 9 years in prison, and I found out about the Bangkok rules after I was set free. And from that, the Bangkok rules are the basis for us to have free women. We knew that there were rights that had been breached, but when we found out about the Bangkok rules, they said, I mean, even so far, I mean, to what degree were these rights breached? I mean, if we would have known from the very beginning, I mean, that we would have been able to demand one way or another, that they be respected. So this lack of knowledge of women, as a matter of fact, that I knew in my presentation of all the public officials and all the people who are part of the custody personnel in the penitentiary system, and they all need knowledge. Thank you very much, Claudia. Colette, it is your session, this question that I just posed, your ability to give you that. Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Not surprisingly. I think that there should be spaces within prisons for women to both have the opportunity to have workshops, to bring in human rights experts, to talk about the Bangkok rules, to talk about the Nelson Mandela rules, the Tokyo rules, all of the things that Sven referred to in his presentation, and just basic human rights issues. Torture is another big one that, how do you prevent torture from taking place in prisons? How do you stop, how do you prevent sexual abuse? And I would widen the question to not just include people who are deprived of liberty, where it's obviously very important that they have access to these tools. And I would add to the toolkit, if you will, published materials that are accessible for people in prison to understand what their rights are. So that they can demand that they be respected, as Claudia said. But I would also widen it to prison authorities, people within the justice sector who also need to be familiar with these international tools. And my experience in talking to authorities around the region is that often that is not the case, that they're particularly out of capitals, that there are people who are in charge of prisoners and aren't aware of what the regulations are that they need to be following. So I think doing training with prison authorities and with justice sector personnel on human rights, on issues related to women in prison, and all of the issues we've been talking about is very important.
Can I go as well? I think I would even go broader than what you guys said, the prison system, the broader criminal justice system. I think an important component is also access to free legal aid. And there's international standards which have the same status as the Bangkok rules that talk specifically about legal aid. Not just access to a lawyer, but a broader concept of legal aid that also includes legal education and access to legal information and other services, including for people who are in prison, but maybe more importantly, before they get to prison or when they are arrested at the first stage at the police. Already the importance of having someone providing legal aid is so crucial because it can influence the whole process. And actually the studies from the US that if you end up, because you didn't have rapid access to a lawyer, if you end up in pretrial detention, then you're much more likely to also be sentenced to imprisonment. So legal aid, including legal education, is very important. Also access to a lawyer in prison. And we just implemented a project to specifically facilitate women's access to legal aid in 3 states in Western Africa, together with UN Women. And the experience was really interesting because we took this holistic approach, trying to work not just on legal reforms and not just on training criminal justice officials, but we also got a number of civil societies on board that work with women in prison, as well as women victims of gender-based violence. One organization in particular I want to mention is Advocate in Sierra Leone, which do a fantastic job in both providing legal aid, accompanying clients before or when they're imprisoned to educate them about their rights, but also to help them obtain remedies in court. And the project was able to get additional funds to those NGOs, and the results have been incredible. There were cases of individual women who had a case pending, didn't have a sentence for so many years, and were finally able, with the help of a paralegal from Advocate, to get their day in court and to be released from prison, because obviously they didn't have committed a serious offense. So that's not to say that civil society organizations should bear the whole burden. In fact, the standards that I mentioned, UN standards on legal aid, specifically mention that legal aid provision is a state responsibility and a duty for the state to set up a system to provide those people who cannot afford legal assistance, or in cases where the interests of justice require it, to make it a state responsibility and a duty to implement that, whether it's through funding CSOs, civil society organizations, or more importantly, to set up an appropriate state body. So legal aid, I think we have to think broader in terms of this additional duty, not just lawyers, but paralegals or whatever the criminal justice system allows to have. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Una segunda pregunta.
Right, thank you very much. So now we have a second question that we have there. Where should we start the changes in the criminal international policy with a gender focus to actually transform the reality of those women that are deprived of liberty due to crime, due to drug crimes? So I would like to start with Colette. Where should we start? Where is the most effective place there? Where should we can you repeat the question? Where should we start the changes in the criminal international policy with a gender focus so that we can transform the realities of those women that are deprived of liberty in drug-related crimes?
Well, that is a very broad question. So, and I'm not real sure where to start, but I'll share this reflection. I think that it's been very interesting to see the evolution of the debate on drug policy in Latin America in recent years. I've worked on drug policy now for more than 30 years. I'm dating myself. And for so long, it was taboo to talk about drug policy in general. You know, these are policies that have largely been exported from my country, the United States. Often, the United States uses its political, economic, and military might to ensure that countries in the region, particularly poor countries in the region, you know, have adopted these punitive drug policies with all the consequences that we've talked about. And you really couldn't talk about it. And that began to change in the early part, you know, about 10 years ago, I'd say. And specifically, as we approached the 2016 UN General Assembly Special Session on Drugs, there was a lot of discussion in the region. And Latin America was really at the forefront of leading the international debate on the need for drug policy reforms. And of course, Colombia knows this very well, because Colombia was at the forefront of those discussions and really saying, you know, we've done everything we were told to do, and look at the consequences that we've had to bear in terms of violence, in terms of deaths, in terms of corruption, et cetera. And yet the drug trade is still alive and well. So it's really time to rethink and reform policies at the international level and at the regional level. And so there were debates in the UN and at the regional level. But where this has not trickled down is to the national level. I mean, we've seen some interesting reforms at the international level that, of course, are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of, you know, after the UNGAS, their, you know, human rights is much more prevalent. It's much more, it's clearly stated now in the context of international drug policies. Their gender focus was incorporated into the UNGAS final outcome document. I think civil society is playing much more of an important role than they were allowed to play before, so that space has grown. But if you look at what Latin American countries have actually done in terms of reforms, it's been very disappointing. So, for example, I was mentioning that we did this report in 2010, which was the first report looking at the relationship between drug laws and prisons. We revisited that report in 2017 after the UNGAS to see how had things changed. And despite all of that talk and about the problem of over-incarceration, and particularly the problem of women in prison, when we looked at the numbers, they had just continued to go up. So the rhetoric had not transformed into reality at the ground. So I think if you really want to start changing the situation on the ground for people who are deprived of liberty, it has to start with changes in national level laws along the lines of what I said at the end of my presentation. I mean, I think I have a vision for a future where drug laws are no longer putting people in prison. But as we move in that direction, I think we need to make sure that sentences are proportionate with the crime committed. We've dramatically increased the number of things that are considered drug-related crimes. There's so many things that shouldn't even be considered crimes that are crimes in many countries across the region. We need to, as I said, end the use of pretrial detention except in the most, necessary cases. We need to end mandatory minimums. We need to allow judges to consider mitigating factors, which would make a big difference for women in prison. So I think there are things that we can be doing, that countries can be doing at the intermediate level that would help significantly reduce, and using every possible disposal and creating options in the law, every possible option at your disposal for alternatives to incarceration. And just everybody should read the UNODC toolkit that's been presented, which is full of ideas on how we can have a different approach to the issue of incarceration and drug laws.
Muchas gracias, Coleta. Le doy la palabra entonces a Sven, por favor.
Steven, gracias.
When they had just adopted the 2009 political declaration on drugs, which was purely technical, demand reduction, supply reduction, international cooperation, nothing about gender, nothing about criminal justice reform. And I compare that now with the outcome document that Coletta mentioned from 2016 from the UN General Assembly special session. It looks like the world has completely changed. Suddenly it's possible for member states to adopt recommendations about mainstreaming a gender perspective, ensure the involvement of women in all stages of the development, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation of drug policies and programs. This was unthinkable just less than 10 years prior. It also mentions proportionate and effective policies and responses, mentions specifically alternatives to imprisonment. So I think at the international level, a lot of progress has already been taken. And now it's a matter of activists and policymakers to follow up on that, policymakers to implement what their governments have basically agreed to, and advocates to hold them accountable to say, look, why haven't you done this and this and this that you said you did? In Latin America, what comes to my mind is the success that the feminist movements have had in so many states in getting criminal laws reformed in terms of the crime of femicide or feminicide. I think almost all Latin American countries now have criminalized this specific crime in one form or the other. And to my knowledge, that's largely due to feminists organizing themselves and lobbying policymakers for it. And I think that's been a huge success and could maybe serve as an inspiration, at least in this particular area as well. And finally, just one reflection also following what Coletta mentioned about intermediate stages. It's been my experience working with prison and criminal justice authorities that when you have a strong leader, someone who's committed to implementing reforms. I've met, for example, a prison director who said when the Bangkok rules were adopted, this is great, I'm going to implement this in my prison. And she pushed and pushed and pushed, and finally it was the official prison policy that was adopted, basically referencing and drawing upon the Bangkok rules to a large extent. So these people are crucial to have someone, maybe not at the top of the government or the ministry, but someone with a position of power who can influence a specific institution or part of the criminal justice system. That's really important. And then to empower those people, work with them, support them, to help them also convince other policymakers is, I think, a useful strategy. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Y por último, le damos la palabra a la doctora Claudia.
Last but not least important, we're going to give the word to Dr. Claudia. Yes, of course. Thank you. Several things were already said by my colleagues, by Coletta and Stephen. When we have spoken about seeking for alternatives for the prison, this would have to enter these criminal policies. Something that we have spoken about throughout this seminar, including this block, to adopt, as I said in my presentation, to adopt all these international resources. And as my colleagues have said, Tokyo standards, why can't we adopt them in Colombia? If the Constitutional Court has named this in some instances, the government have not implemented them. The other thing is to consider the experience of those women that have been freed or released from prison. Given that they have been in prison, they believe that we do not have anything to say and that we're simply ignored. And this experience is very important to be able to reformulate all these criminal policies in the country. And lastly, I believe that we must change the conception to adapt these policies of other countries. As Coletta said, we are always focused on looking at what's happening to the United States, and we adapt this to the United States, to Colombia's. We must change this view, and we should do things in a different way. We're always thinking that we should be certified a jail or things like this. If we're going to be certified by the United States, if they comply with or do not comply with some criteria, and what do we get from these certifications? If these people who are deprived from liberty continue to have breaches in their rights, what does it change? What does certifications change in the construction, in the infrastructure? With this, nothing changes. So we know that there are jails that have been certified, but the breaches of these people are the same that they have been living with and that have been proposed in the Constitution. So our criminal policy must be more direct to our Colombian culture, to a region, as when we speak about Latin America. So, and it should not be as it has always been done, that we copy from other places. So we are different women, and I will tell you that we have had, we as women that have been free in these women organizations, we have had contact with women that have left Colombian prisons, but also from Latin America and people from the United States. We have spoken with women that have been Spaniard prisons, and we know that the conditions are the same. And we have also realized that if the breach of rights in some aspects are the same, we know that the cultural conditions can change. And from here, I would like to also manifest that there is a Latin American network of women who have been freed from prison. This Latin American need in prison of women who have been released from behind bars, and we're constructing this international network. So what we're requesting is for this creation of criminal policies and public policies for our experiences to be included. Thank you very much, Claudia, Dr. Albea, and Dr. Steven, for the presentation of this blog. We thank you for your expositions, and also we would like to say that it's something that would be useful for the constructions of public policies and these matters that are focused on this topic. So with this equality visual focus for women, and now finishing this thematic block, I would like to invite all the participants to continue in this YouTube transmission, especially in the following thematic block, which is going to be speaking about the administration of laws for women with crimes related to crime, and is going to be moderated by Dr. Andres Diaz. Thank you very much to all. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the valuable presentations that you carried out.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Pues vengo de una familia económicamente no así, lo necesario para poder sobrevivir, ¿no? A los 17 años conocí al que ahora es mi esposo. Y su trabajo había sido ayudante de albañil o así otras cosas. O sea, lo que ganaba era nada más, pues, como decir, lo necesario para poder sobrevivir. En una ocasión él se pidió un dinero prestado. Ahí fue donde las cosas se complicaron más, porque pues lo que él ganaba y lo poco que yo también aportaba, pues no era suficiente como para ir cubriendo la deuda. Ya cuando pues el familiar empezó, pues no, ¿cuándo me vas a empezar a pagar? Que mira que el tiempo va corriendo. Él se ponía de muy mal humor. No, dice, pues para que nos quede más, ¿por qué no me apoya usted? Pues realmente desde un principio estuve consciente de que en el momento de alguna detención, pues este era el lugar que me podría esperar. Pues lo único que le pedí a Dios era que me librara. Porque pues cada vez que salía de la casa siempre pensaba en mis hijos. Ese día veníamos como cualquier otro día y directamente se fueron hacia nosotros. Quítate la ropa. Yo sabía realmente que haciendo eso, pues ahí sí. Y le digo, no. Sí, dice, quítate la ropa. Pues ya la insistencia, pues, y tuve que quitarme la ropa. Y ahí fue donde, pues, fue cuando me encontraron la droga. Dice, te vamos a quitar a tu hijo. No me lo puede quitar. Sí, sí te lo puedo quitar. Y dárselo a una familia que de verdad lo quiere. Sí, le digo, yo amo a mi hijo, ¿cómo de que no? Cuando me dice la señorita de la gente de migración, me dice, prepare la ropa del bebé. Me lo voy a llevar. Y muchas veces pues tengo que aguantarme mucho para no llorar por teléfono. Y siempre trato de sonreír cuando estoy hablando con ellos, para que ellos no me escuchen así. Échele ganas, les digo, así como yo lo hago aquí cada día. No va a ser eterno el tiempo que esté aquí.
Hola, papito, ¿cómo está? Yo estoy bien, ¿y usted cómo está?
He aprendido muchas cosas sobre la violencia contra la mujer y es algo que me gustaría mucho poder ayudar a otras mujeres también, que con mi experiencia ellas puedan aprender cosas de que tú como mujer tienes el derecho a decir no. Y cuando dices no, pues nadie puede obligarte a hacer las cosas. Sí. Eso.
Bueno, muy buenas tardes a todas y a todos.
All right, good afternoon to all, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome again to this closure panel in the second day of this event on the exchange of experience of women and drug trafficking, being held by the Ministry of Justice and Law and UNODC. This is our third day. We're reaching our second closure, the second day, excuse me, and we have been able to see this, the first stage of the value chain associated to drug trafficking, and it is going to be the production stage. Today in the morning, we were addressing everything that had to do with the complex roles of the women in these that have been provided of the liberty, and now we have reached our following panel that's called Administration of Justice for Women for crimes related to drugs, experiences, and failures. We have heard in previous spaces with the prevalence of these crimes that women find themselves in prison, the drug trafficking, manufacturing, and possession of drugs is in the first place of the participation. 45% of the women who are in prison. This percentage is higher than other crimes like 20% for crimes and theft, like that. Now, women have greater problems when they are in prison because these jails are not always prepared to respond to their needs in the medical side or family side. These prisons, they have very little mechanisms and spaces for the caring of breastfeeding and or for them to keep or house their children. Now, the feminine hygiene is quite limited also in these prisons. The work that these women sometimes develop when they're been in jail for drug trafficking, and as been mentioned in the prior panels, is the consequences to those situations of the hierarchical positions, like keeping their custody to the children, separating from a partner that mistreat them, or loss of a family member or job, and this is always an environment that do not always offer them all the opportunities that they should have. So here through the administration of this justice route or road is several things that we must consider here. On one side, we're talking about the penal side. Some components of this, the defense, are reached, and the technical defense sometimes because understanding of the judicial language or lack of reliability or trust, sometimes they're far away from their interests. So sometimes when these women are in that ethnic women, sometimes they lose this sentence, and now these sentences are quite high in general. They are always getting them these high quantity of year sentence, and when we're speaking about women, the prevalence is higher with men. The sentencing for these women are higher. Now, these penal codes are stronger for the women's. And now we're going to be able to see through these following presentations, where we'll be speaking a little bit on the women that have been deprived of the liberty because of drug trafficking in Colombia. We're going to have an approach on the reality of the imprisoning of women in other continents, where what nurtures the reality, not only in Colombia, but also in Latin America. We'll be able to get to know a little bit about the attention protocols for women who have been linked to drug trafficking cases. At the end of the day, will allow us to identify those success and those learned lessons that they have had. So we are accompanied by three experts that I would like to introduce. While they're beginning their presentations, we would like to invite everyone and for you to write all your questions and comments in the chat or via Facebook or YouTube, and it will help us a lot if when you write your questions, you can direct them to the person you wish to ask, or if it's for all the panelists. We will begin with the presentation of Veronica Martinez. Veronica Martinez has a bachelor degree in law and public administration by the Ortega Gasset Institute. She's also a teacher in technology. She also has postgraduate studies from UNAM. She has more than 20 years of professional experience in development and management of international and national projects, and as an expert of the prevention of crime, human rights, gender rights, and public policy.
He's currently an expert on citizen security in the design, coordination, on management of strategies of activities financed by diverse donors of several countries in Latin America. He's an expert consultant and evaluator nationally and internationally of public policy for governments in Latin America, and who is here with his guest lecture to balance justice, the effects of gender in enforcing the law for drug crimes in law. Veronica, once again here, and this venue is all yours. Thank you very much, and good afternoon to each one of you. And for me, it is a great honor to share this venue with international guests that are so recognized. Jeroen, Eka, Andres, thank you very much for allowing me to address you and exchange ideas. And likewise, I would like to thank the UNODC, their representative in Colombia, the Ministry of Justice and of Law of the Colombian government, and the Director of Drug Policy, Andres Peña Andrade, to open up this venue and for the invitation to actually talk about a topic that is ever more visible. And as we have mentioned, because technology sometimes betrays us, please let me know if you can read my presentation, since that whenever we have in the full screen, it's really very difficult for me to see it. We can see it and we can hear you, Veronica. Oh, perfectly. Yes, please go ahead. So the working tables that we have had actually let us know of many of the things that we have to do, of the comments. So I placed there for the mobile phone there, and then we have there, thank you, the times that we have had there, the specificities that are very concrete. And for me, it is the value change of the drug trafficker and the criminals. They will never have a value chain. They actually destroy the value chain in the social capitals and economic and cultural ones within the country. They destroy. So I call it not a value chain, but a disvalue or devaluation chain. Fortunately, we have heard that when we're speaking of this, we're not speaking of homogeneous groups, but we're actually talking about different groups of women and of criminal groups of men and women that are of vulnerable people. And thanks to the analysis of the cross sections, we can speak of different groups of women, and within the groups of women, we can speak of different levels of vulnerability. I cannot overlook the identification with the words of the beginning in their guest lecture of Isabel Jacome, and that is because these issues that they generate a lot of frustrations, and then we have there of the time fundamentally there to actually tackle the drug trafficking aspects of organized crimes, and we will not get tired of repeating once over and over that. I'm losing the signal. I can't hear properly, and that we have here, and it's not the human ones and not the ones that we're having here. And in this sense, this type of venues that we're having, actually, there are kind of some plugins to recharge our battery so we can have optimism that within these responses, we can have to begin to build from diversity, from the construction, from the co-construction with other countries, with other groups of women, with other groups of professionals, and of course, always questioning the status quo and always proposal in respect of any questions that may arise. And there, at any rate, it is firstly important to mention the participation to balance justice. And this is a reference, the work of Pitt Waller, who is a relentless defender of them that we have there. And then we have the basic premise that in respect of the social problems associated with violence, no reform to the penal system cannot be substituted in the different ways. And this applies, of course, to women. And then we have there of the challenges that we're having, and there my colleagues have actually testified to this, that many of the risk factors and the detonators of the participation of women in the drug trade, they are associated with the structural conditions, community, family, and interpersonal ones that actually can be summarized basically in exclusion gaps, vulnerability gaps, and inequality gaps. In my case, with this presentation, I would wish to highlight the gender factor. I'm losing the signal every 2 seconds. And then we have here the ones of drugs, and this for this one, I divide my presentation in 5 areas, 5 points that I want to cover. And the first one that I need to do, and I was very pleasing to actually have it in the prior presentation, is the issue of the invisibility that neutrality gives. And this is important because here, when I dialogue with my students when evaluating public policy, whenever we define the public policy programs, we always start from a premise, is that in the way that we think problems, we are thinking the solutions. And in the past years, we have seen how we have given a particular attention to the war against drugs or the war against drug trafficking. And this actually places all of our attention of researchers and of the policies and politicians who issue policy and citizens in the most immediate effects and visible effects, which is the violence that they have there of the criminal groups and all these state forces. So this is not a coincidence, and it's not a minor issue either. It actually, what they wish is to reduce homicide. This is the most serious crimes, and it actually has emotional and social impacts as well as economic, political, and the ones who are murderers, they kill people and so on. This is there. So now we have specialized groups of theirs that men represent the majority of the perpetrators of these new wars of drug trafficking. It's men who do the wars, urban wars against drugs as we have already documented by the UN and in the UNODC. Homicide has a very specific profile, and it's young men that live in Latin America that are somehow tied to gangs or to organized crime, and that mostly they actually commit in context of the presence of firearms and by young men who are, due to many risk factors, usually social exclusion, and of course these factors increase the degree of lethality, how lethal it is. And this means that the majority of men represent the majority of men that actually have contract, and they actually come in within a penal system. The majority of these people, therefore, that participate in these drugs, they participate in violence, that are the victims there, and that they are in the penal justice. They're all men. So the first conclusion that I already mentioned in this international exchange is the response of this unitary one-size-fits-all don't work. This one-size-fits-all for the prevention responses of prosecution and of punishment are thought through for men, and therefore from a masculine point of view, and not only dealing with an issue of drugs and how do they prevent all these risk factors associated with them, and who are the main victims of this, and how they participate, all the other groups in the penal system. They have not thought of women. These have become more and more invisible, and therefore in the responses there, as well as in the ways of prevention. And this is very important, because when I have spoken with many institutions of international cooperations and that of the UN, many of the practices and the policies, preventive policies, are also thought and focused there from men. When from evidence we can actually see further there is to invest in women is a solution that is more price performance cost effective. And the second thing is that the knowledge, based on empirical knowledge, fortunately has grown very much in the past 40 years, but dealing with the gender perspective and the analysis of the gender, this is actually very scarce. And when I have performed these reviews of literature, for example, published literature, when I mentioned about the criminal history and the sort of evolution of them, the majority of all these perspective and the analysis focus once again on men. Fortunately, ever more the stories on women and the women's participation in organized crime and in drug trafficking are ever more abundant, and therefore they're particularly abundant when it has to do with the penitentiary systems and their impact. But still we have one of the most important ones, and one of the greatest one of these studies, actually their qualitative thinking really of what is due, and we have still a very great debt dealing about data that one may generate around the all these areas that impact women, although all these life histories that we have here, that we have heard, given all the studies that they have pointed out, they give us some sort of tips on what really happens and why do women get involved in all these things. And here we have another risk factor of these parents who are absent or single mothers that you have there, also to maintain the protocols when we're dealing with women that participate and have addiction, the way they're actually directly tied with the family or with the couple, but also the group expression that this is particularly relevant in Central America, the access and the identity there as a way of protecting there for the very women when they get involved in these groups mainly of drug trafficking. But also now we have some alert signals, and this has already been mentioned. For example, yesterday we did that what happened here of the articles by Jacqueline said the recent studies that they have mentioned, the qualities of drug trafficking, and then we have in these bodies not associated with a palette or a specific situation of vulnerability, the association of them and the redefinition and so on. And then we have as to how are minimizing many of the impacts that you have on the women have and the policies of inequities, and they do not allow you to see clearly how they're involved in the organized delinquency and what you have with the inspiration of the power, or at least that you don't get to see that with the 3 studies that we did in Mexico that you had between 20 and 28 and 19 to 20, and then you have there between the states of Mexico, and also unfortunately we have been increasing about the national, there's associated to a set of values and not of a set of leadership, where what we have is not a lot of difference and that of women, and also the use of other interpretation there's of the other techniques of neutralization and so on, and then we have them fundamentally us, and that they use them as the techniques of neutralization that young women and young men use when they get involved in the drug trafficking in the studies that we performed in 2019 to answer to the request of the World Bank. And this is what we usually have normally that are associated to survival and to risk factors and structural problems that you have in society, economic and educational, and lack of opportunities. And so this is what I wanted to speak, then was mentioned in the prior table that we decided to have there. And then we still don't understand that in the measure that we have here in the process of these studies, what we end up generating in other countries, we can find these lessons learned mechanism. And this is what I mean by focusing in those mistakes and looking at the academia and the production of policies. We could have spoken or could have mentioned in the exchange about women before the penal processing of the women, but I would like to focus myself mainly in 3 links of the production of justice and so on. First is the contact of the conflict between women in the penal realm is one of them in the penal process, and then the other one that I would also mention and is the execution of the rulings and giving sentencing. And for me it's really very important because in the first part you already spoke about how the police actually active and the importance of police when dealing about what we have to see as warrants in the system and how they mediate many of the results that they actually have in the judicial system. Then we have the forecasting, and they have already mentioned of this first calculation, and the role of the police is really very important because it's given very strong lessons, and especially when we speak of the transcendental one of the reform of the current police officer and how they're trained, because the damages that they have had of these contexts, especially for the control of a popular protest, and then we have in general terms and in Latin America and in the global realm of justice and in the United States, is that a stern iron hand doesn't work. The majority of the work that the police perform in the prosecutions are actually in flagrancy, and this actually never gets investigated, and there is a whole set of indicators that are imperative that we continue to reinforce the idea that detention of the people, in this case of the consumption of all of Latin America, from all I have, this is depenalized, but then treating of the position and the transport and marketing, which are the other 3 crimes for which women are actually put in there. Well, we have there that there is a clientele that is very interesting for the police. When the performance indicator in the arrest there actually there's where you have there of the mentality of the importance in these in the detention, they actually becomes like another note as to why we detain, why do they arrest women for these reasons, and this actually gives us to a power there of trying to deal for the detection and so on, because we have had there, they're pointing out there that we can have that the police, at least when treating about Ecuador, they were becoming there of an anticipated justice and so on. I'm sorry, I'm not understanding very well what's saying. The signal is really very poor. And then we have there that we can have there of these quotas of there to trying to pretend that they're actually giving results in this content and effectively that they're working there. But in Mexico, actually, this has become a bit more difficult. And what we're doing here that actually are dedicated to capturing statistics and data, and according to the idea, the dynamics of the relationships in the home, for example, they're speaking about a fourth victimization, mainly a machism against women in this first contact that we actually doesn't have to do with the detention and the direct interaction with women. But here what we have, for example, is that when women are detained by police or by the Marine, 80% of the men are hit, while 57% of the women are detained. And in the survey of this population that is deprived of liberty, the police actually, they speak about between 9 and 30%, or 9.9% to 13.5% of the women that are detained by the police suffered a rape. And here we were talking about 13 or 14 of every 100 women that are detained by the police are raped. And this is recorded for the year 2016 by the Mexican government. So this has had several consequences, and Mexico has had, for example, 3 rulings against there by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and specifically because of the abuses of the army and the police. But in terms of police, what can work? And here I can mention that fortunately Colombia has been carrying out all these forums for their police reform, but the fundamental question that we must do when we're speaking about what we're doing in the police is, why do we need a police? And what do we want a police for? And if we were to answer that, then with that one in the national realm, we will see how we can do it. Not only in Latin America, we can find a whole array of responses that help us to see how this police can actually provide us more service. The penitentiary system, as I had pointed out, fortunately, we already have a great discussion that we have had here. But for me, the most important thing that we have been able to do in the report is, Stephen Faison, is that they speak to us about how we can balance the justice system in respect of what we're having to face in this penal system. And here is the importance of the contact of the legislative branch and the results that they should have, that it should not be impermeable to the knowledge that is being generated in these forums, the impacts of the legislature and the judicial decisions. And here specifically, we should have a focus there. The gender focus doesn't work. What it doesn't work is in the data we have. We don't have there the provisioning. It doesn't work in the prevention. It doesn't work in criminalizing, and it doesn't work in the more severe rulings. Why? Because when we're seeing this initial prohibition, we're seeing that ever more you're having more and more people in jail. And this doesn't indicate that people are committing more crimes, but actually we're having more people the same as whom we've always detained, being detained by the police, and they're actually entering with the jail with a special design there for so many years and so on. And then we have here, and here we can see there of the transformer here, and then we have, it's very important here, and then we have, it's not been taken here as the constitutional line for Mexico at least, that are basically 3, and they have to do with what we can not hinder the procedure, so you don't evade the accountable person or the person that's been accused or not, or that they don't get punished, the victims there. But here we're talking that the preventive prevention dealing with drug crimes, especially with possession, the simple possession and the possession with the intent of marketing, and the marketing and transport that they're using there with the pursuant of general prevention that they can have, then they'll have there, and they don't have to do anything related with data. That criminalization just doesn't work. If you criminalize it, you don't eliminate those aspects that are, you're actually prosecuting the lowest people in the drug trafficking chain and so on, that we had already mentioned before. But what I find even more relevant, it actually has to do with this. In the 3 minutes that I have left, I should have very little information in respect of how do they try women and so on. We have seen the impacts, but we can see the qualitative. What is the justice that is actually being given to women? How do they impart justice to them? in terms of it's not really conclusive. And for Latin America, what it prevails, and we have had is the case studies, and here basically they're all qualitative. However, we have certain studies for Mexico that we find that are particularly relevant in terms of the consideration of the data that you have here, that we have pointed out, and then the ones that you have an important message. And from here, you can speak here of the two study of Ovevilla as well as Arellano. There's a qualitative, there are no differences in how you're sentencing men and women. And this means that if you were to stop, if a man gets arrested for marketing there, or a woman is get to stop there, statistically, they are receiving exactly the same ruling. This is from a quantitative point of view. We would be speaking that we're in the presence of some neutrality and therefore a proper enforcement of the law by our judges. However, when we're speaking about the gender focus and the and the cross sections that we have, we're going to see the impacts of neutrality when they have to do with differentiation of their consequences and the life of their women. And here is also very important to mention, because the main powers have been very reticent. They have been trying to reject. They always seem that all these figures of neutrality are more than enough for them to point out that the quality of the justice is high. And then we don't have it here when we can have there of the ones that we can have when we have there in respect of women. And this is that, unfortunately, that we have there of the human.
That we should not see it in this way. This is the last thing of this administration. This is a problem with the access. It's not about being able to pay a lawyer that can help us with this. And this is something that we have to look at, and look at the services that are being rendered to us. These services do exist, and how can we access them? How do they figure in the penal codes, and how these people who represent these people, this is translated to reliability, the trust that we can have in a person, so we can have the results that we wish. And we must respect and accept these outcomes, even if we're not in agreement with them. There's justice for these people to obtain this justice with independency of their ethnic, education, money they have, depending in the measures that there is problems not being resolved, or the legal problems not being resolved, but not interfere, where we're not only putting in risk the reliability on justice and also the trust of the country. When we do not trust the country as we don't trust laws, it's always the thing that we have because of lack of respect to all the laws. So to differentiate, and for important ways that we have in violence and also for crime, and fortunately we have to be able to balance out the law. We must, my time is finished, but I don't have 1 minute left. We must expose and start assessing our judicial system, and here we must consider how are these laws are being acquired, what are they reinforcing, what are the stereotypes that they continue to look at during the resolutions, and what are those cultures that exist around this decision making, these instruments to judge these people. There are many instruments, and we can clarify them in respects to this large problem that we have. If it's procedural law, if it's constitutional, if it's transparency to reduce the account rendering, these things that strengthen in the legality. And I insist, it's not possible to do this with human rights. It's part of the government. These we can extend all these reference is not only the United States, it's also other countries in Latin America. The examples that we can, and just think about the different alternatives that we can get. We have examples. We have examples in Argentina and Costa Rica. Even though we don't want to use them, we can learn from them. We must think and rethink about the transparency in this performance indicators, because when we're looking at it, we are finding out that they are being put under the lamp into this crimes, and they require a lot of transparency and what could work from a point of view of the interdisciplinary coordination in the development of our penal system in Latin America. And for these units, the follow-up of these measures at the measures before they go to prison. So unfortunately, we also have all these focus that are leading, and that we have in other panels, the participation of experts and also women who have been affected. We have instruments that we must use as reference before are tried and during the trial as well. And by part of the continuation of the UN for UNODC and the judicial procedural law as well. This fundamentally of tool, jumping on these protocols, speak about gender and the guidelines that are being used by the Crown in England, and the things that they have gone through is very important to point this out. We have very good instruments, and we must look at all these sentences that have been given in Latin America, but how are we going to be able to have this indispensable to be able to use this when we are going to judge someone when these judges are receiving this? This means that, and last but not least, important to know how we can have this. We have these transparency tools from different role players, and it is very important to have these references like we did in Mexico. It's about all the sentences since 2020, they are public. Of course, excuse me a little bit for my delay, but we're speaking about the first time in our country we are able to use and see what kind of justice we have and to do things correctly. And it seems that they're embedded, and in the balance of these things that can come out of this, there's two aspects, and we must weigh in on, and it's the public policy. The second of those is the cause, the electoral cause, and we must start thinking differently. So here I will do my presentation, and I would like to thank all of you, and excuse me for passing the time allowed, and thank you for your attention and participation in the space that we have. Thank you very much, Veronica. Thank you very much for the management of your time. You have mentioned very important things. From the beginning of your presentation, I have the invisibility phrase that gives neutralization, the prevalence of victims, and have impeded for these responses to be thought out for women as well. So this had not been so fundamental, and it is very important. And now we'd like to continue with our following presentation. We have a lot of lack of research, but we do have, and we have clues, and we also have alert signals when we begin to identify the women that are belonging to these illegal structures related to drugs, those survival aspects, the social ones, economic ones as well. And you have mentioned, you have highlighted the importance of police, the importance of reducing this first contact in this plan, and the importance of the judge as well. We do not mean the prevention does not work, the preventative criminalization does not function. So these key aspects that I dare myself to summarize in a very respectful way from your intervention. I would like to thank you again, Veronica, for your contribution. Now we will continue, and we would like to remind you that in the invitation, we can write your questions in the chat. So for the different speakers that are in this meeting, so we're going to continue. I would like to introduce to you Erika Ngomachili. I hope I have pronounced her name correctly. She's a lawyer in human rights, and she sits in London. She has been working for the last several years in the Open Society Foundations as a rep in human rights, and to have local through the defense and exercise in the past. EPA worked with the Institution of Human Rights of the International Association or International Lawyer Bars or legalization programs in the local aspect, and also international. She also worked for UNODC from 2014 to 2016, directing the research on the Western and Asian countries for prisoning for small crimes or misdemeanors that had no relation with drugs. So she's the author of many publications on alternatives for incarceration, especially for women, and she is busy from the University of Essex in international rights and human rights and PNAO. So welcome, and your presentation is titled "Women Who Are Related to Crimes Related to Drugs in Europe and the Analysis in These Advanced Rules."
Thank you very much, Andres. Let me share my screen, if you don't mind.
Déjame compartir mi.
Lovely. I hope you can see the presentation.
Estamos viendo tu presentación.
You can see the presentation, right? Could you please confirm if you can see the presentation?
Eka, vemos tu presentación. Continúa, por favor.
Thank you, Andres. Thank you. And apologies for not being able to speak Spanish. This is my second time to engage with the Latin American colleagues, and I think it's inexcusable for me not to be able to communicate with you in your native language. And thank you very much for the invitation. It's highly appreciated, and I'm very much sort of looking forward to sharing the experience from the region, but also learning from you all on this very important issue. I was attending the presentation before, and then I know that number of data that I wanted to present has been already presented by rather esteemed colleagues. So what I would like to do in sort of attempting to provide the data worldwide, I'd like to highlight some of the specifics that apply to the Europe and Central Asia region. It's very interesting because in 2012, I authored a research called Cause for Alarm. And at that time, it was with the organization called International Harm Reduction Association based in London. And we did a research in about 53 countries in Europe and Central Asia to analyze the information and the statistics in relation to women drug offending. And I remember rather vividly that we were referring to the number of the women in prison worldwide that was just above 500,000. And it's astonishing to me as to how the numbers have changed, since then in rather maybe less than 8 years from that particular time. I think that what's very important to highlight is that the numbers have not just changed or increased in other parts of the world, but they also have been reflected in the increased data in Europe and Central Asia too. Big countries such as Russia obviously take a large proportion of the overall numbers of those women in prison, and we obviously have about 120,000 women in prisons overall for the drug-related offences. That would be about 30,000 women, which obviously constitutes about 28% of the overall numbers. I think what's really important here is to highlight the disparity or the differences between the countries in Europe. Europe is a small continent, but rather diverse and quite large when it comes to the number of countries, the types of legal systems that are implementing different types of laws and policies. And I think that for the purpose of this particular presentation, it's possibly quite important that I focus on Eastern Europe and Central Asia, because this is a region that I know the most, and at the same time, it's a region that I think that has most in common with the Latin American context in terms of the societal development, in terms of where policies are. With regards to the repressive laws at national level. I think that what's important to highlight in the context of the disparity is also the numbers. I display here some of the data that I was able to collate from the research that shows that quite a large difference. For example, if you look at 5% in Bulgaria, that is the data of basically women in prison for drugs in relation to the overall percentage of women in prison. And then you have got 25% in some of the Scandinavian countries and 40% in Spain. And, more importantly, then you have got Latvia, which is the highest percentage and the representation of women in prison for drug-related offences. And obviously some of the Central Asian countries are slightly different. Which sort of maintain between 28 and 32%. However, interestingly enough, you have got Tajikistan, which fluctuates. And I think one of the colleagues in the previous section was highlighted one particular country where it was mentioned that I think it was Ecuador, that it highly fluctuates from 80% to rather low. And Tajikistan is a great example to compare to that case because it's a country that heavily administers amnesties to basically alleviate the numbers of prison population to basically help the overcrowding problems. However, it's not the greatest solution that can be used. I think that one of the things I wanted to highlight in terms of the disparities is also the percentages versus the numbers. So, for example, one of the figures that I did not bring here, but also is in the research that we did all those years ago, is a case of Iceland. If you look at the percentages of Iceland, you could say, well, it's about 57% or so of women in prison for drug-related offences, but the total number for Iceland, women imprisonment is just 7. So you can see that it's very important to not just look at the percentages, but also look at how the numbers are presented, and then what's the sort of relation between the numbers and the percentages and the overall numbers of the female population in the country as well, because I think there's a greater a correlation to be made there as well. One of the things I wanted to highlight for this particular panel is the particularities of the Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and that very much lies in the driving factor for this region, that is the injecting drug use. As you know, Tajikistan, I mentioned the country earlier, has the longest land borders with Afghanistan. Afghanistan is the country that produces number of different types of drugs, and particularly the heroin, which is then transported into Europe and Russia in particular through Central Asian countries. This is one of the routes, right? And this has its own consequences in terms of the injecting drug use. And over the years, possibly last 15, 20 years, the civil society organizations and researchers have been talking about the increasing numbers of HIV amongst injecting drug users, this particular key population being the driver of the HIV epidemic in this region. However, there's very little, in fact, done to address the issue to really kind of address the problem rather than rather than the effects of the issue itself. And we see that, for example, in Russia, rather harsh laws in general related to drug use and related to drug possession. Very little differentiation between the the different types of involvement in the drug dealing. It's the same in Ukraine. In fact, same in Georgia. These are just examples that I'm trying to highlight in here. And then same applies particularly in Central Asian countries. One of the things that I think is important to highlight as well is that these laws, they do not exist in vacuum. They obviously are product of certain past of all of these countries. They used to be one unit. Therefore, the laws very often are almost identical, and they're very much part of the so-called the Commonwealth of Independent States, which is very much run and dominated by Russian influence. And you know, one of the aspects there is also collaboration in the law enforcement sector, and very difficult it is to actually have an influence with one country without actually, you know, addressing the large number of them. And what makes it difficult to address the large number of countries and the states in particular is the inability to access it. So I think it's very important to really remember that the laws in these countries, they're quite similar, but they're also very difficult to change because they're looking at each other's laws to copy, and that comes from this sort of a very shared history and understanding of how policies are particularly made. The other problem that I think is not specific to the region, it's quite universal, but it also relates to the types of governance systems that we have in this region, and really rarely functioning democracies as well. And that relates to the lack of data in general. And or the methodologies with which the data is gathered flawed and not really sort of relevant for the current current situations, current issues that can be sort of used as a solution to. And I think that also reflects to my experience when I did the research a few years ago in Central Asia and West Asia, where we found that it was very difficult to get any data in particular from, for example, countries like Uzbekistan, countries like Tajikistan. We would get direct responses from countries saying this is a state secret, we can't give you the statistical information, which makes it very difficult indeed to analyze the issues, analyze the problems, and then make suggestions or offer solutions for those problems. The particular issue that I would like to highlight in relation to women is the gender blind policies. A lot was said about it by a previous colleague as well, and also in the previous panel, a lot was said about general gender sensitive policies. But I think that what we have in our region is just generally gender blindness. It's very common, and not just in the drug field, but overall. There's a very little consideration of what women specific sort of services might mean. What's very interesting is that the overall research obviously indicates that drug crimes are committed by individuals that have low income. The unemployment is very scarce for them, poor housing, bad health, people who have had some sort of a sexual or other types of violence experience. There's also very interesting data indicating that whilst it's important to look at the vulnerability aspects, it's also important to look at the active participation of women in the drug trade. And I think it's very important to actually consider that and look at the multiple layers of women's engagement in the drug trade, or in drug use, or other types of activity that is related to criminality indeed. One of the specificities also that we would highlight in our region would be that I also already spoke about the HIV, but there's also many cases where women would develop the comorbidities such as the tuberculosis, hepatitis C, HIV. We had a case a few years ago when I was with the Eurasian Harm Reduction Association, a case from a Ukrainian lady who had a terrible history, and in fact she died because of the police violence, on top of her living with HIV, tuberculosis and hepatitis C. It was a very tragic case. And what we see is that the services that are supposed to, the health services, right? So that's harm reduction services maybe, or other types of services for treatment, multiple types of treatment. They could not really cope with the demand, you know, with what this particular woman needed. And one thing that is very important to highlight here is the endemic levels of violence. Violence against women obviously is not a new topic for those in the field, but there is something more in this regard in our region, in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, but particularly against women who are somehow involved in the drug activities or drug offending, if you like. We have some horrific cases of police abuse against women. We have some cases of extreme stigma and discrimination. We have cases when state health services collaborate with the police and so-called operatives to ensure that those with HIV or those who inject drugs are caught and sent to prison. And we have tons of cases, for example, of such in Uzbekistan, where HIV transmission is also criminalized. So you have a sort of a bigger picture as to what sorts of problems you might sort of come across if you're a woman with the drug using issues in this particular region. One of the things that I think is very important also is that the testimonies that these women give. And I would like to read out one testimony from a research from an organization that just did an analysis of these testimonies. She says, Svetlana, who is 14, I'm 40 and I don't know anyone who was not touched by the cops. Several times the police searched me, did not find anything, but threatened to lock me up anyway to plant drugs. They discussed in front of me how much to plant on me and what a term I would get. And obviously, this is a quote that really sort of highlights the relationship between the street police officers in particular with quite a significant power at hand, and then how sort of that plays out, unfortunately, not in favor of women. But how do the countries in our region respond to these problems, right? We see that over the years, you know, the systems are getting militarized, politicized, centralized, and desensitized. The reason for this is that, you know, criminal justice systems in general and drug policies as well, they are a very good political sort of an issue, right? And then it's very easy to be populist around these issues. And a very good example for this would be Georgia, which is a country of my origin, in which the civil society groups and the think tankers had a really great insider who was willing to take the initiative for the reforms forward. The moment he obtained the power within the government, he turned his back against them, despite the fact that he himself is a medical doctor, but now turned politician. He's now definitely not in favor of working with the groups of activists who were, you know, pushing for the reforms. So it's a very vivid example as to how quickly the cards can be changed. And I think that what's also really important is that, and I'll get to the alternatives in a minute, that how that sort of impacts the women in particular in our region, is this idea of, you know, emptying the prisons out, getting the new people in, emptying the prisons out and getting the new people in. And then this is a problem that goes around and round and round. And what's really interesting here is that Tajikistan, that I mentioned as a country of example, when I was looking for a data in 2010-11 for Tajikistan, we could not find any data at that time. And I found data through WikiLeaks files, if you remember at that time, that was very new. And those files actually showed that there were significantly high number of women in prisons for drug offenses. And then I voiced these numbers at a certain meeting where a high-level official from Tajikistan was present, and he was not very happy, obviously, with my presentation. And we then saw them publishing the data, which was much lower, and we reflected that's also reflected in that particular publication. But what's very interesting is that you see this sort of a practice, particularly in Tajikistan, in which country lets out 3,000 prisoners in one go. And the question now here is what sort of purpose such approach to sentencing serves, right? And what does it do for those women who actually might have needed rehabilitation, might have needed the protection, might have needed sort of further services from the government to actually be able to benefit from the system. There's the laws about the alternatives to imprisonment in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. They are quite good. They just need implementation. They are, in some cases, even you can say that they do consider issues related to women, particularly pregnant women, particularly women with up to child or children with up to 3 years. But I think what's really lacking there is the political will or the ability of many of the implementers in our countries to actually have these laws implemented. Many of these, include, for example, we don't have a country in our region that has a police diversion schemes. There used to be such in a country called Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia, which was modeled on the Washington State Seattle, which was it's a lead program in Seattle. But once the donors organizations pulled out from support, the government was not able to take it on. So the police diversion schemes as such, they don't exist anymore. Pretrial, I think, a very similar situation to Latin America as to how they're implemented. Women are definitely sort of subjected to equally to men. I don't have data and research to speak to this, but there's no data to suggest that there's a particular sort of a leniency or a lack of leniency towards women in the application of the pretrial measures. Yes.
Se nos está acabando el tiempo. De pronto, si pudiéramos ir cerrando tu presentación, por favor.
I understand you asked me to finish.
Sí,
when you can, if possible, yes.
Abrir un espacio para quienes nos escuchan y tengamos el espacio para
listen to us, and if we could have a Q&A session, we'd be much obliged. So if you could begin to close, we'd be much obliged with your conclusions.
Yes.
If you could start with.
Thank you very much. Yes, so the solutions and recommendations, I think what's important to highlight here is
que estamos diciendo aquí y para
the empowerment of the groups, the economic empowerment.
Grupos y
I'm hearing the interpretation for some reason.
Realimentación allá.
the economic empowerment, which you know, to provide the opportunities for the groups, particularly women groups. We do have a number of cases in the UK. In particular, there is a case in Georgia in which women drug offenders or women drug users have come together to set up entrepreneurships, the entities where they can actually work and make money and then create jobs as well for the society. So I think that's a very important point to consider. Social empowerment, which maybe mainly relates to sort of supporting the peer groups and then really sort of empowering the groups to lead the discussions with policymakers on the ground. And I think that it's very important and also relates back to the meaningful participation of those communities mostly affected by the policies. Political empowerment exactly relates to the social empowerment in which the groups affected engage with the politicians. We unfortunately do not have many cases to provide in our region whereby women would have had such space. There are some individual cases that we can definitely provide, but there are not many that would make us proud. And I think one thing that I would like to very much highlight here is that you know, different disciplines have only recently started looking at the issue of drug policy. For example, feminism was very much sort of inwards looking and not very happy to take some of the drug policy issues. But recently, I think there has been more and more openness towards sort of feminist approaches to drug policies. And I think that theory really needs to translate into practice. And then sort of, I think that approach will help to, you know, come up with new ideas, particularly people on the ground. I'm going to leave the suggestions for later on because I'm aware of time, and I shall not like to take more of the time, and apologies that I exceeded it. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Seca. Seguro tendremos oportunidad en el espacio de preguntas para
your presentation briefly to give to our following speaker, mentioning the importance of acknowledging the difference between countries have making comparisons. This allows us to know this information, and we Colombians are different. So I believe that each country we can mention basically the same thing, but here the important thing would be to achieve the goals and the good practices of these other countries, but we must think about our own characteristics in the country. My reflection here on your presentation is the need to get to know those women who are linked to this drug trafficking, to know their risk factors, to understand their protective factors, their drivers, their needs, their economic situations. This is what allows us to create better programs that are targeted towards this aim. So listening to your presentation makes me think about the importance of the different approach, not only for women, but an individualized approach, perhaps programs that have been adjusted to each one of the needs they may have, the economical, social, political, through interdisciplinary recommendation is the recommendation that I take from your presentation. Now we're going to give the floor to our final speaker. We would like to remind you that all those questions and all those comments that you have can go in the chat, so we can now we have Jaime Lynch. He's a researcher in human rights in penal and penitentiary and drug policies. She's the co-founder of the Research Center on Drugs and Human Rights. It's an NGO that's from Peru that's seeking to protect the human rights of the most vulnerable people in the drug war in Latin America, and specifically in Peru. In other responsibilities, he has been a coordinator of the judicial clinic and the research Center for Human Rights and Drugs, and created guidelines for public defenders so they can improve the public assistance to these women who are in prison for drug-related crimes. He's a master's from the University of Murcia in Spain, and his course in a postgraduate on the same topic. He has more access for these women who are in jail for drug-related crimes in Peru. Jeroen, I will ask you to please be on
Hola, buenas tardes a todos, todas y
Um,
todes. Antes que nada,
to all of you.
quisiera agradecer al
anything, I would
Ministerio
like
de
to thank
Justicia y
the
del
Ministry
Derecho de
of
Colombia
Justice
y
and
UNODC
of
por
Law
invitarme a
in
este
Colombia
evento
and UNODC
y a quienes me
for having
acompañan
invited
hoy
me
en la
to this
mesa,
event, and for those
Andrés,
who accompany
Verónica
me
y
in the
Eka.
table, Andrés, Verónica, and Eka.
Voy a compartirles
I am going to
mi
share
presentación. ¿La ven? ¿La pueden
my
ver?
presentation. Can you see it?
La estamos viendo.
Perfecto.
Yes, we are seeing it. All
Mi
right,
presentación hoy se enfocará en
My
el
presentation today
acceso
is
a la
going to be
justicia para
focused on the
mujeres
access of
privadas de
justice
la
for these
libertad
women who have been
por delitos de drogas en
deprived
Perú,
of this
compartiendo con
the
ustedes
liberty for drug-related
la experiencia del consultorio
crimes
jurídico del Centro de
from
Investigación de
this
Drogas y Derechos
judicial
Humanos,
center,
incluyendo un ejemplo
in
de
regards to the human rights that
recomendaciones
they
en
and
la
the
aplicación de
recommendations
alternativas a la
that we
detención
can give them in
preventiva
the
en casos de
alternatives
mujeres
of
procesadas
this
por delitos de drogas.
women who have been processed for drug-related crimes.
Disculpen, quiero pasar. Ay, perdón. Ok. Recordando un poco lo que ya se ha venido dando y un poco más de contexto
Reminding you
antes
of a little
de entrar
bit of
al
the
contexto
things that you have
peruano,
seen
quisiera
already in
empezar
the
esta
context before
presentación
we enter the
recordando
Peruvian context. I
que
would like to begin
en
this presentation
2020 se ha
reminding you that
cumplido el
in
10º
2020
aniversario de las reglas
have
de Bangkok, recordando también que hay más de
10 years already of this
740.000
Bangkok rules,
mujeres y
and
niñas
there
en
are
las
more than
cárceles
740
alrededor del
women and
mundo,
girls in
y aunque
jails
son
around the
una
world.
minoría en
And even
comparación
though it's a
con el
minority,
número de hombres encarcelados en
compared to the
prisión.
men who are in prison around the world, this number is increasing every year with a higher frequency. So for this reason, we have an important need to improve the access to justice and to prioritize the non-preventive jail sentences for women. We have been able to conclude this report that was published in 2013 by the Defensory of the for people, the alignments for the implementation of the Bangkok rules, the standards in the penitentiary system in Peru. That was published again in 2013 in Peru. We have published this study, and nowadays we haven't had the impact of this Bangkok rules after 10 years of its implementation, but those who work near and hand by hand with these women who are deprived from their liberty, these drug policies in Latin America have given place to many penal responses that are harsh every time, more difficult every time, or harder every time. They have given them to the women. These policies offer very little space to explore alternatives that are non-privative of their prison sentence, to reduce the number of women in jail, considering that these women are sometimes single mothers. 8 of every 10 women in Peru, and that are and they're the caretakers of their family, and in Peru is not an exception. And in this current context for drugs against war against drugs, it's always more important to prioritize the use of these measurements of non-preventative measures for these women that are involved in the judicial penal system. These women who have been prosecuted for drug-related crimes in Peru, that are around 6 of every 10 women, are mostly found in vulnerable socioeconomical situations, and even though they're in this situation, they're small actors of this drug trafficking chain. However, they're being arrested and punished with all the weight of the law. According to the data that we have from the Peruvian penitentiary system, in every line you can see this data that corresponds to December of 2018, December of 2019, and the last line, December 2020. So you can see the increase of these rates. In December of 2020, there was around 86,955 people in prison in Peru, which 4,928 were women. A third part of these people are in preventative prison. 34% of them are awaiting their hearings in their courts, sometimes during several years, given to the burden that these courts have and the administrative system that is still struggling to adapt themselves to the new technologies of information and communication. In regards to the drugs, 1 of every 5 people, in general terms, 18%, are being processed or prosecuted or convicted for drug-related crimes. However, and this is where we enter into disparities in gender. These indicators show that there is an important disparity in gender in regards to these drug-related crimes. 26% of men are deprived of liberty before 53% of women. The number of women that have been involved in drug-related crimes have been increasing throughout these years, and it has been translated to a greater number of women who are in preventative prison or who have been sentenced or prosecuted for such cases. Reminding you that women played a small role in this drug trafficking chains, like their mules, their transporters, their intermediaries of the purchase and sale of drugs, or sometimes they just do micro trafficking with drugs. And the disparity of gender, while this number of men have been in preventative prison has been reducing in the last 3 years from 39% to 33%. In December 2020, the number of women in preventative prison has been stable in 40%. Additional to this, 43% of the women who have been imprisoned are going to be there to their have turned 3 years. And 2020, December 2020, there were 84 mothers with 84 children in prison. 29 kids and 29 boys and 45 girls. Excuse me. It was overpopulated. It was overcrowded. So this is a very important number in the sense that if there was 86,955 people deprived from their liberty in Peru, the capabilities of holding these people in prison is of 40,800 people. So this means that this penitentiary system in Peru is submitted to an immense pressure, not only because of the high numbers of overcrowdedness, also for the limited access to the basic hygiene installations like good medical services, scarce work programs and education programs, limitations to family visits and conjugal visits as well. Last but not least important, if you divide the budget among 365 days a year, we can see that the budget per person per day, it's incredibly low, around for housing, security, water, feeding, nurturing, or medical needs. We will continue now. Based on these numbers, on this data, for us, it is concerning that for every 6 of every 10 women are in prison for drug-related crimes, and it is nice to remind you that their imprisonment normally has a deep impact, not only with their families, but also in their communities, other than their precarious needs and the isolation. These women are confronting poverty and high stigmatization, being stigmatized, and it's higher than those men that are in prison now. This traditional role that they normally have as mothers who normally take care of the children, jail supposedly a double or triple punishment for these women who are running the risk of losing their rights and to be rejected by the society itself, which makes it more difficult to be rehabbed. So it is important to know that these breaches of vulnerability in the social part before this program in 2011, the Investigation Research Center for Drugs and Human Crimes will open nations to implement a judicial consultation that began from 2012 to 2016 under the coordination of a person with all the support of 3 other lawyers, thanks to an agreement that was signed with the Episcopal Commission that has been working with the jail systems for many decades already. We have attended with this judicial consultory around 3,000 women, offering them an comprehensive attention from all the stages of the penal cases, with penitentiary benefits, grants from the presidency, health issues in the emotional part in these jails, seeking looking for dictionaries for these foreigners that are imprisoned, and also interpretation services for this penitentiary services and all these people who support them. Finally, in regard to the summons of this information, but that's very specific in regards to this crimes related to drugs, we have created this guidelines specifically for these women. Finally, we were able to sign an agreement with the justice system with 2 axes. The first one to accompany these public defenders in the attention to these women for drug-related crimes, and the creation of a protocol for the attention of these women who are deprived of their liberty for these drug-related crimes. And here we can see the front page of the front cover of the protocols that we have created. Natalia Barria and I, one of the lawyers in this office, these protocols of free access, and it is available in virtual means. This is the content of these protocols. Is to say that from a technical standpoint, we are speaking about the legislation in drug matters, but then we will go to the recommendations, the good practices, the learned lessons from the police detention or arrest, from all the benefits you can have in the penitentiary center. We also consider that it was necessary to carry out a second edition to be able to nurture this first edition with all those cases that we continue to attend external from our office. And I wanted to propose an practical example, recommendations that we have proposed from our office in regards to the daily work with our lawyers in regards to the preventative detention. Here we have a base where we can work on, which is interesting. However, we are countercurrent with a system that continues to punish instead of seeking resocialization per se. So remembering you that the preventative imprisonment is, excuse my redundancy, in exceptional features that can only be applied as a last resource in a rigorous way based on the principles of reasonability and necessity and proportion. In Peru, according to the new penal codes, they must comply with a number of criteria to justify the use of the preventative prison. One, the existence of this punishment, and the second one, that the crime can be under 4 years of imprisonment, and the third one is the people who have been accused or convicted for some reasons try to elude the system and does not allow to construct this investigation. It's also nice to remind you that it is necessary for these criteria to be complied. Is to say that if the first budget if there isn't enough evidence, the judge must apply non-preventative liberty rulings. So the preventative, in this practice, the preventative has an impact that goes beyond the personal circumstances of the person who have been accused. And this is the case of those women who are pregnant, those moms who are breastfeeding, because they are the main people who are caring for their children. So those women who are deprived from the prison, remembering this, are single mothers. Like 8 out of every 10 women, is important to know that in the majority, they're the only support for the family. So I would like to remind you briefly the Tokyo rules, which can provide different things for these women who are deprived from liberty, and to have this as the last resource. And I also remind you of this Bangkok rules, which they drive you to the states to sentence these women for this and to give them fair treatment in this penal system, considering that their records or backgrounds and the reasons why they did this crime. In this sense, and based on the Tokyo rules and the Bangkok rules, is that from this office, we have believed that it is necessary to call the attention or draw the attention of these judges on these hearings of the preventative sentencing, the Administrative Resolution 325 of 2011, which sets forth that judges can incorporate in their analysis other criteria in their analysis that we have already mentioned to justify or to the application of this preventative sentence. In this case, judges can consider the difference of gender before they classify these preventative sentences. For example, the analysis that we have proposed from our judicial office is proposing some criteria like to be pregnant, to be a mother that's breastfeeding, or main caretaker of the children, a high probability of social things like study, health, work, high probability of suffering sexual abuses or other type of violences. The reason that are sometimes socioeconomical ones that have driven them to carry out these crimes, like in the drug-related crimes, this impact of this preventative prison being inside or outside of jail for these women. And finally, I believe that this is something we must always mention from the current state of the penitentiary system in Peru. Now, which of the following steps and regards to the work that we have carried out from this firm and the attention protocols, the following step that we would like to implement in the regional level is the creation of a regional postgraduate directives to public defenders that include modules on drug policies in the region, penal systems, and penitentiary systems for like an optimum knowledge on the topic of both, and finally to share theoretical and practical tools with gender perspectives to monitor and to assess these strategies, and finally the implementation of public incidence actions in these public policies to be able to have access to this justice with gender perspectives. And because for the minute I have left, I would like to wrap this presentation up. We taken from that urgent need that we have for the application of the alternative measures to this sentence that deprive them from their liberty, and other more education for these public defenders, so they can support these women who are deprived from freedom. And why? Well, because these public defenders are in the front line for the attention of these women. It's the fact that we must recognize and to be able to use as a leverage to incide in these policies or in the reform of these policies. However, I am aware of all this. It is necessary to remind you that the penitentiary systems, not only in Peru but in the whole region, are highly overcrowded or have a high load. There's an unending war against drugs in this region, and we are in the zoom of cognitive population in Latin America, specifically in Peru. So I would like to wrap this up by acknowledging that we have a long path to go, and we're going step by step towards it. So thank you very much for your space and time.
Thank you, Jerome, very much for your time. We have very little time. We don't have much time for Q&A. One of the phrases that you really drew, a system that actually demands to punish doesn't necessarily rehabilitate, doesn't help really the criteria there for a practical, concrete, and very manageable. And now for the EPAs, now we have the questions. Let's start with one you were mentioned here, a greater training to public defenders. And that led me there to the questions that we have received in the chat. And the questions that we have received in the chat are for all of you. So I would like to ask, in the interest of time, a very concrete answer in respect of the question, and wherever possible we can be concrete. We will be able to tackle the other two questions. So the first question that we have, in certain countries where we have the training in general of operators, justice operators, but they evidence that they do not change the male view of how to enforce law. How can we do that? Who wants to start with not having that male vision when enforcing the law? Does anyone have a deal? Perhaps Enka? I don't know. You want to start? And then Veronica, and then Jerome? Is that fine, that order? Eka, please. Gracias. Entiendo que esa visión masculina y es el abordaje al implemento de aplicar la ley, ¿correcto?
La pregunta que nos hacen es que se fomenta siempre una capacitación.
We always encourage training in gender to the justice operators, judges, prosecutors, but that doesn't necessarily change the male focus, the male posture when they actually enforce the law. So what can one do to kind of counteract the situation? What can be done?
Thank you. I don't think that the trainings itself actually help to change the practice. That's not how it's done, and I think that's where possibly many countries and many of us also get it wrong, because trainings is something that everyone likes, and it's the easiest sort of way to educate someone. As we sort of would like to tick the box and then say, well, it's done. I think it's more complex as to how you change someone's perception from male to sort of more individual based, whether it's a woman, whether it's transgender, whether it's a man. Gender does not just connote to a woman. Gender means the roles that the males and the females and non-binary individuals perform. Therefore, I think that there's possibly more sort of need to understand the roles better and where the problems lie. Trainings are good, obviously, and then do as many as possible. However, there's also ways of including certain incentives in policies. There's ways of interactions and engaging different parties. Some of these interventions, they're not new. They have been done for years and years. But I think what's important is that, particularly in this day of age, and I don't know if it's the same in Latin America, but definitely in our part of the world, the far-right movements and anti-gender movements are very much on the rise. And that's not only just specifically against particular women or women, groups of women, but actually the sort of more of a sort of a conservative or more of a reactionary sort of an approach to the implementation of the law. And I think that's where possibly there's a need to address the issue, which is that, you know, more comprehensive, more participatory, meaningful participation, as it's called in the public health terminology, to the issue. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Eka, por tu opinión. Verónica, ¿qué responderías tú?
Thank you very much, Eka, for your opinion there. And Veronica, you would answer to the same question. What would you do? Can you hear us, Veronica? Yes, of course. Well, and this says, I am convinced there be the different international assessments that we have done, especially, but also about the global north, actually to point out that the institutions are changing. However, these assessments don't give us that results are contradictory, and it depends on several factors. I want to focus myself on one of perhaps we cannot account fully in the presentation that I give, but I think that it's key when we're talking about the institutional transformation. This is that we have been doing some reforms and we have been training with different legal instruments and with different wills. However, systems have not changed. And this is how we're living the response of police, of the prosecutors, and of the judges, which is what I wanted to present. And we continue to speak that a good police is actually when they do an arrest, and that in respect of the quality of the attentions, and when how they have respected human rights, and respect that arrest actually can have a final sentence and therefore justice for the victims. So what happens with the judges, or what we do here, is that they're doing is that their performance, they're not by the quality there, but actually because based on what a sort of perception of life misunderstood, they actually can have this pressure to use preventive jailing, and so it's important to discourage those incentives. And there we have some international pressures as well that we see it in the police, and when we encourage those incentives, and here with something that we have been operating in all of the reports that we have had in the United States, every time that we do of the police, and the last one of them is Obama's. If you change institutional incentives, you can see the privilege and the performance and the indicators you can see there of the reform. So here, I think is what we're looking is to sort of conjugate three premises, so that, and then we can have the first of them is the political will, so the things that there means that somebody have to take the political leadership, and the second one is a technical capabilities, and this is effectively that we're going to measure what exactly we want to measure on by establishing the right meters. And the third one is a strong system of transparency and rendering of accounts of accountability, and then we can have there, and through those three means I think that we can have change. And I would like to close my participation by pointing out the following, that I would really like to rescue of the three presentations that we had here, and that is that if we had a culture of prevention, actually we would have a very strong, you would not need a very strong repression mechanism. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Veronica, for your intervention. Now, Jerome, your comments in respect of the question
Estoy de acuerdo
posed.
con digamos, las intervenciones de mis compañeras. Quisiera agregar también
made, and I would like to add
que
also
hay una digamos, retomando una publicación que se hizo desde el colectivo de estudios Drogas y Derecho, el CED, unos años atrás, junto con de Justicia en Colombia. El título de la investigación era La adicción punitiva, referencia a la desproporcionalidad en América Latina frente a los delitos de drogas. Quisiera entonces retomar un poco el panorama en el cual se mueven los defensores públicos, se mueven los jueces, los fiscales también, en el sentido en el que existen cuotas, existe un control interno dentro de cada institución que revisa, digamos, las medidas que se podrían haber adoptado dentro del marco de la lucha contra la inseguridad ciudadana y la lucha contra el narcotráfico. Estoy hablando de control interno porque hay un gran temor por parte de jueces, por ejemplo, de ser demasiado laxistas en cuanto a medidas alternativas a la prisión efectiva, por ejemplo, o a la prisión preventiva, en el sentido que, bueno, me va a caer el control interno si dicto una prisión preventiva más. Entonces, digamos que es un panorama en el cual hay que poder, o que hay que tomar en cuenta a la hora de revisar la data sobre, digamos, encarcelamiento o desproporcionalidad también en el país o en la región. Quisiera mencionar eso, retomando también el tema del género. Sí es cierto que se dan capacitaciones en materia de género a los funcionarios del Poder Judicial o de la Fiscalía de la Nación o de los defensores públicos, pero el sistema en el cual navegan es tan...
The system in which they navigate is just so corroded, and in certain times it's actually they are sort of side by side with an old system in respect of the old penal system and so on, that then we're going to have a whole set of barriers that we have to solve. I do agree that the protocol that we have drafted is not going to change the overnight, but it is a first step so that we can actually have the adequate terms, the adequate strategies to be able to try to change bottom up. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jerome. Regrettably, we have ran out of time. We would love to take more questions that we have received. We know that it is a topic that generates a lot of curiosity, a lot of interest in all our participants to find those best practices and lessons learned in matters of managing justice and imparting justice. I will be closing by saying, Veronica, thank you. Jerome, Erika, thank you very much for all your participation. Thank you for all your expertise. And of course, you are cordially invited, and to whom are listening to us, to the last day that we would have, which will be tomorrow, where we'll continue with our agenda link in this, which is the drug consumption from the gender perspective. And we expect you tomorrow at the same channel at 8:30 in the morning. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon, a good morning, and a good evening, depending on which side of the world.